Chapter 243. In the silent night of the valley, there were no weeds as far as the eye could see. Instead, there was a dark night sky that stretched between two precipitous walls. Fan Xian tidied up his clothes and tied up his torn left trouser leg as he said in a quiet voice, "I'm sorry. That fairy's surname is Yi. Her name is Yi Qingmei." Yi Qingmei? Xiaoen was shocked. "What did you say? Could it be that the mistress of the Yi family is the fairy I once met?" When the Yi family suddenly rose to prominence, Xiaoen was still the head of Northern Wei's secret service, so it was no surprise to Fan Xian that he knew the name of the mistress of the Yi family. He smiled. "Aside from the fairy you speak of, who else could have the Yi family change the state of the world in a few short years?" "So that's how it is, that's how it is." Xiaoen coughed again. No wonder the kingdom of Qing could rise so fiercely. So there was the shadow of the temple behind it. "Wrong," Fan Xian said. Fan Xian said, "You are already a person about to die, so let me tell you, Yi Qingmei, the fairy you speak of, is not an immortal from the temple. She is like us, just a normal person." Xiaoen had not yet recovered from his earlier shock. He did not believe what Fan Xian had said. Instead, he was immersed in his last question before he died. "Why did the fairy want to capture me and bring me to the kingdom of Qing?" As the head of Northern Wei's secret service, he naturally knew the relationship between the Yi family and the Overwatch Council of the kingdom of Qing. "The kingdom of Qing had to kill you back then," said Fan Xian. He paused. "I must admit that back then you were a very terrifying person. And the reason why Yi Qingmei sent Chen Pingping to capture you instead of killing you must have been because of your friendship back then. After all, it seems that it was because you broke into the temple that she came to this world." "Then, just who, are you?" In the darkness, Xiaoen's eyes stared at Fan Xian like two sharp arrows. For an old comrade on the verge of death to still have such sharp eyes, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a little startled. He chuckled. "Me?" After a moment of silence, he opened his mouth. "I am Yi Qingmei's son." Yi Qingmei's son. How Fan Xian wanted to be able to say it aloud to everyone in this familiar yet strange, intimate yet inharmonious world. Unfortunately, there was no such possibility right now. The night was getting darker, and the darkness before dawn had arrived. In a cave with only the two of them, Fan Xian spoke quietly and faintly. "I am Yi Qingmei's son." For some reason, the moment these words left his mouth, Fan Xian felt much more relaxed. His heart, which had borne too much pressure, struggled free of the many branches and vines on it in an instant. At least, it obtained a temporary relaxation and gently embraced the taste of freedom in the night wind. The sky gradually brightened. There weren't many memories, but Xiaoen spoke very slowly. After a day and a half, Fan Xian had finally achieved the most important goal of his journey north. He looked at Xiaoen and said quietly, "Do you have anything to tell me?" Xiaoen just looked at him with a strange expression. After a while, he gasped and said, "You are her son?" Fan Xian nodded and smiled. "I don't have the habit of calling someone my mother." Xiaoen coughed violently, shaking out the last few drops of blood in his heart. He seemed to be crying and laughing at the same time. "No wonder you know so many things. No wonder you are so interested in the location of the temple." Before he died, the old man finally saw everything clearly. Gasping for breath, he said, "It seems that this cave won't be able to hold you. I don't have the habit of throwing myself into a death trap." Fan Xian had already prepared everything. He moved closer to Xiaoen. Xiaoen suddenly stared fixedly into his eyes. "If you want to live well, don't go to the temple." Fan Xian's face was calm. He didn't reply. Xiaoen didn't look at him again either. He only turned his gaze to the precipice behind Fan Xian. He frowned slightly, as if thinking about something. After a while, the old man gasped softly. "I used to think that I was a ruthless man who didn't fear death. I only sought freedom. Now that death is right in front of me, I know that everyone is afraid of death. There is no one in this world who isn't afraid of death. For some reason, Fan Xian looked at the dying Xiao En and slowly loosened his right hand. He said softly, "But perhaps death is not the end. Perhaps you will go to a completely unfamiliar world." This was his greatest secret, his greatest regret. Xiao En's gaze fell into the distance. His bloodshot eyes gradually softened. "Are you really the son of the little fairy, no Yi Qingmei?" Without waiting for Fan Xian to reply, Xiao En continued indifferently. "But you don't look like her at all," Fan Xian said. "You've only seen her when she was 4. How can you be so sure?" Xiao En smiled. "Because you are far less beautiful than the little fairy." Fan Xian subconsciously tilted his head. "In this world, there are not many women more beautiful than me. The look in your eyes is different." "How is it different?" Xiao En looked at him. With a hint of coldness, he said, "Only now do I understand." On that snowy wasteland, the little fairy gazed at the vast white earth. Her eyes were still soft and compassionate. I never knew how to describe it, but now I seem to feel the coming of that darkness. Only then do I understand that all the emotions in her eyes were expressing one thing. What is it? Fan Xian's heart jumped. The love and attachment to life. Xiao En smiled and said, "Although there is always a bright smile in your eyes, it is not the same. Your mother should be an extremely sentimental person, but you are an extremely heartless person." Fan Xian smiled. "I don't deny that. I've killed many people in my life, so I never expected to have a good death." Xiao En did not continue this topic. He looked at the misty sky in a trance. "To be able to die in this cave, as you say, a good grave is not bad." Fan Xian half squatted by his side and put his left hand on the old man's shoulder. He found that the old man's muscles had gradually softened. The sky outside the precipice was still dim, but through the mist that pervaded the valley, a holy light could be seen. This light shone softly on Xiao En's withered face. It made this secret agent, whose hands were stained with blood, and who had spent the latter half of his life alone and miserable, feel a sense of relief. "Danzhou doesn't have those 2 date trees, does it?" This was the last thing Xiao En would ask in this world. Fan Xian took the last needle from under the old man's ear. After a moment, he confirmed that he was dead. He tilted his head slightly and looked at Xiao En's body. Suddenly, in a soft voice, he said, "Although Danzhou doesn't have those 2 date trees, perhaps there is a better world waiting for you after you die." Xiao En's eyes had already softly closed. His pupils were bloodshot, and he could no longer look at this strange world. Fan Xian let out a murky breath and laid Xiao En's body flat in the deepest part of the shallow cave. As for whether or not there would be any eagles pecking at him, it seemed that he had not considered that, so he appeared somewhat cold and emotionless. He walked out of the cave and reached out his hand into the air outside the precipice. The white mountain mist moved along with his fingers, and all he caught was empty air. The brocade guard should still be searching for the bodies or traces of the old man and the young man at the bottom of the valley. The precipice of Swallow Mountain was as smooth as a mirror. No one would have thought that someone would be able to jump off the cliff and stand steadily. And no one would have thought that someone would be able to climb up the slippery and wet mountain walls. Fan Xian's whole body was like a piece of paper, tightly pressed against the mountain wall. Behind him was the thick morning mist, effectively concealing his figure. Even if someone was on the opposite side of the mountain wall, they would not be able to discover that he was slowly climbing up like a gecko. When he was in Danzhou, from the age of 12 to 16, he had spent a full 4 years controlling his zhenqi outside his body. This was an extremely foolish method of cultivation, but Wu Zhu did not care. Fan Xian practiced it to his heart's content. Unexpectedly, later on in Fan Xian's life, it had helped him so much. Crawling like a gecko, sticking close like a snake, Fan Xian carefully climbed up and up, his face expressionless. The effects of the ephedra pill had long since faded, and his zhenqi was somewhat lacking, so he did not dare to be careless. The shallow grass rustled slightly, and a hand clung to a rock beside the precipice. A person covered from head to toe in black night clothing climbed out of the valley like a ghost. Fan Xian's face was covered by a hat. He turned his head and saw that the valley was quiet, as if nothing had happened. After a moment, his heart skipped a beat. Through the thick morning mist, he gazed at the mountain forest, but he could see nothing. But he felt as if someone was watching him, and that person's gaze seemed to be fixed on him. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and turned around. He did not think, nor did he have time to think. Like a black arrow, he plunged into the thick mist, running in the direction of the capital. Outside the residence of the diplomatic mission in the capital, Gauda held a long knife in his hand. His eyes were as round as a fierce tiger's as he stared at the people in front of the courtyard. The young master had not left the house for a day and night, and all visits from Northern Qi officials had been refused. But early that morning, someone from the brocade guard had come to deliver an edict from the palace, saying that the young emperor wanted Fan Xian to enter the palace for a chat. Few people knew that Fan Xian was not with the diplomatic mission. The commander of the brocade guard, Shen Zhong, hoped that Fan Xian was not with the diplomatic mission, but after a night of searching, Fan Xian's body had not been found. So Northern Qi finally became suspicious, and so they urgently wanted to know where Fan Xian was. Who would have thought that the people of Qing would be so rude and unreasonable? Using Fan Xian's drunkenness as an excuse, they forcibly prevented the Northern Qi officials from entering the diplomatic mission. Conflict was about to break out, but at that moment, a rustling sound came from the end of the street. It was not the sound of street sweeps, but footsteps. The Northern Qi officials were overjoyed. Chapter 244. The morning in Shangjing was bustling. Several groups of people had arrived at the entrance of the diplomatic mission. The Northern Qi officials and the brocade guard parted to make a path. They bowed respectfully to the girl who had leisurely approached. "Greetings, Miss Haitang." Haitang's eyes were drowsy, as if she hadn't woken up yet. Her hands were still in the pockets of her flowery dress. She yawned and asked, "What are you all doing here?" One of the officials hurried forward to report, "I have come by imperial edict to invite Sir Fan Xian into the palace, but Sir Fan's bodyguard refused to announce his arrival." More officials from the brocade guard and Honglu Temple came forward to report their intentions. In short, they all wanted to see Fan Xian. Haitang was slightly startled. She didn't seem to know that so many things had happened in Shangjing in the past 2 days. There was a trace of confusion in her eyes. "Why didn't you announce it?" Tiger Guard Gauda knew that although this girl looked like a country bumpkin, she was actually an important figure in Northern Qi. More importantly, during the days the diplomatic mission had been in Shangjing, his young master had often wandered the streets with this strange woman, so he didn't dare to slight her. He stepped forward and said in a low voice, "Sir Fan drank too much last night, so he is not feeling well. He is resting, and it would not be good to disturb him." Haitang muttered to herself for a moment, then said quietly, "Let me take a look." Having said this, she walked toward the front door of the diplomatic mission. These days, she had often come to the diplomatic mission to find Fan Xian, so the people of the diplomatic mission had long since become accustomed to her presence. Seeing her stride inside, Lin Wen, who was standing on the stone steps, couldn't help but feel a trace of panic flash through his eyes, but he didn't dare to stop her. Gauda, however, was wholeheartedly protective of his master. He frowned and gripped the cloth hilt of his long knife. He stood in front of Haitang and said in a low voice, "Miss M." His last word turned into a muffled grunt. Haitang didn't make a move. She just turned her body slightly. Her cloth shoes, which never seemed to leave the ground, made a rustling sound. For some reason, she was already behind Gauda's zhenqi, which had been accumulating for a long time, couldn't find an outlet. His shoulders trembled slightly, and his eyes shone brightly. Haitang smiled and turned to gently pat his shoulder. A strange expression flashed across her ordinary face. Fan Xian and I are friends. I think he will be willing to see me now. When her palm was about to land on Gao Da's shoulder, an extremely gentle and warm current flowed into him. Gao Da slowly closed his eyes. His right hand exerted strength between his thumb and forefinger. The long saber by his side made a sharp sound as it fiercely stabbed into the stone floor beside his feet. The gravel was slightly scattered, and the tip of the saber was more than 3 inches into the ground. In this exchange, although Gauda was extremely skilled, he was still no match for Haitang's realm. Moreover, Haitang's identity was rather special, so he was actually unable to make a move and suffered a loss. Gauda knew that he could not stop Haitang, but he was unwilling to let the young master in the room face Haitang alone. Thus, with a dark expression, he turned and followed the swaying figure into the courtyard. Behind them, the northern Qi officials and brocade guards did not follow. As long as Haitang could confirm whether or not Fan Xian was in the room, it would be fine. There was no need for them to take the risk. "Good morning, Miss Haitang." Wang Qinian, holding a bowl of salt water and a miniature mace in his hand, appeared in the long corridor of the courtyard that Haitang had to pass through. This trusted aide of Fan Xian had seen Haitang a few times and could be considered to be familiar with her. Haitang smiled slightly. She knew that he was here to stall for time, but she was not in a hurry. "What is that in Sir Wang's hand?" Wang Qinian took out the miniature mace from his mouth and extended it in front of Haitang. He laughed and said, "My master invented the toothbrush." "Toothbrush?" Haitang was slightly surprised. "Brushing your teeth?" "Yes." "Why not use willow branches?" "Because this thing is easy to use. It's soft and the brush is exquisite," Wang Qinian said in an ingratiating manner. Only now did he realize that placing the toothbrush that had come into contact with his foul mouth in front of Haitang was a very disrespectful thing to do. He quickly took it back and repeatedly apologized. Haitang smiled bitterly, shook her head and walked inside. Wang Qinian tossed the bowl and the utensils to his subordinate and eagerly followed. He was almost 40 years old and he ran faster than a rabbit. As he walked, he chatted with Haitang. He also said that Fan Xian had drunk too much yesterday and was probably still resting. How about she come back later? Actually, everyone knew that Haitang's sudden appearance in the diplomatic mission this early in the morning could not have been a coincidence. She had to see Fan Xian. In the distance of the corridor, a figure dressed in white was looking at the two of them. Haitang was moved. She turned her head and a chill filled her eyes. So it is the great scholar Yun. Yen Bingyun could see that this last disciple of Ku, he was not in a good mood. Although he had been released by the brocade guard, he had always carefully hidden himself in the back of the residence, not wanting to provoke the officials and people of northern Qi. Before he had been imprisoned, Haitang had returned to the palace, and he had met her as the great scholar Yun. Meeting Haitang today made him feel a little awkward, and he silently retreated. Looking at the tightly shut wooden door in front of her, Haitang frowned and reached out to push it open. She was a young woman, and although everyone knew that she had some friendship with Fan Xian, pushing open the door like this was not very polite. Wang Qinian jumped in fright and tried to block the door. But while his qinggong was excellent, there was a huge gap between him and this woman. A gust of wind blew past, and the wooden door creaked open. A drop of cold sweat dripped from Wang Qinian's forehead. He didn't know if he would make it in time. Haitang looked calmly at the large bed in the room. Suddenly, she said, "Sir Wang, you may leave." Wang Qinian did not move. A tired, cold voice came from the room. "Wang Qinian, you may leave." Wang Qinian took a deep breath, and a look of joy appeared in his eyes. He immediately calmed down and bowed. "Yes, Sir Fan." Haitang walked in with light steps, and the wooden door closed behind her. She did not seem surprised, nor was she in a hurry. She took a teapot from the table, poured some cold tea into a cup, and sipped it lightly. Then she sat down on a round stool next to the bed. On the bed, under the brocade quilt, Fan Xian's face was pale, and his eyes were smiling. He looked at the village girl sitting by his bed with great interest. After a moment, he said, "Are you going to keep looking like this?" Haiteng covered her mouth with her hand and yawned. "If it weren't for the Empress Dowager asking me to take a look, do you think I would be happy to come early in the morning and see your ugly state?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "As for my appearance, although I don't like it very much, I know it has nothing to do with the word ugly." He lowered his head to glance at it and then said, "I believe that she is not ugly." Under the quilt, Fan Xian's robe was pulled open, and in his naked chest was a beautiful woman with long hair like a black waterfall. Drinking with women for a day and a night. Haiteng didn't seem to see the woman in his arms and yawned again. "She's not very beautiful. Are you going to keep looking like this? It seems to me that Sir Fan has no intention of stopping me from looking," Haiteng said with a smile. In the end, it was Fan Xian who became embarrassed. "Excuse me for a moment, so that the woman in my arms can put on her clothes," he calmly said. "You don't have to give me face, but you have to give the woman face. Women, why make things difficult for women?" After the courtesan finished packing, she looked back at Fan Xian with reluctance. The slight resentment, shyness, and charm in her eyes made Fan Xian praise her acting skills. The courtesan bowed to Haiteng with a trace of reverence, then pulled up the hem of her dress and walked out of the room, leaving Haiteng and Fan Xian alone. Fan Xian was still lying on the bed, his hands behind his head. He didn't care that Haiteng had seen his naked upper body. Haiteng was a clever person. She didn't pretend to be shy, nor did she scold him. She acted as if the young man on the bed was a block of wood. She directly said, "Do you know what happened in Shangjing these past 2 days?" Fan Xian was startled, but after a moment he laughed. "Forget it. I can't be bothered to waste words with you. Since I'm in Shangjing, how can I not know? Shang Shanhu lost a group of subordinates this time, and Shaoan was killed by you. I'm sure your teacher will be very happy." "Congratulations, Mississippi." Haiteng looked at him calmly, and the pressure in her eyes grew stronger and stronger. But Fan Xian didn't seem to feel it at all. He still smiled. "Yes, I knew this would happen, so in order to avoid suspicion, I had to lock myself up in the diplomatic mission for 2 days. I'm sure you understand." Haiteng didn't know whether he was telling the truth or not, but earlier in the courtyard, she had given Fan Xian enough time by taking advantage of Wang Qinyan's delay. No one knew why Haiteng was willing to do this. Since Fan Xian was in the diplomatic mission, Haiteng knew she wouldn't be able to get any more information out of him. This young southern official in front of her, who looked like a beautiful young official, was actually a watertight person. Naturally, she wouldn't be able to catch any clues. She stood up and put her hands in her large pocket. Suddenly, she looked at Fan Xian's naked upper body with interest. Fan Xian stealthily circulated his tyrannical jinqi, and his beautiful face blushed. "Why are you blushing?" Haiteng asked with a smile. "You're glowing." Fan Xian suddenly felt an indescribable danger approaching. A day and 2 nights of mental exhaustion caused his face to immediately turn deathly white. "Why are you white again?" Fan Xian took a deep breath and smiled. "The night of spring is bitter." Chapter 245. Isn't the spring night too short? Too long is also a pain. The toothbrush you made. I want one. Fan Xian was stunned. He hadn't expected her to make such a request. He smiled bitterly. "As far as I know, you can buy them on Xiushui Street." Haiteng smiled. "Not as good as you. Thank you for the compliment. I didn't think a noble child like you would be willing to spend so much time on such things." Haiteng looked at Fan Xian as if to re-evaluate him. Fan Xian slowly closed his eyes and said, It is clear that you do not know enough about me. Haitang was silent for a moment. But I only know that after the Empress Dowager's birthday, you will return home. What about your promise to me? Fan Xian didn't even bother to lift his eyes. When I'm done sleeping, I'll come and talk to you. Haitang frowned. That would be good. Fan Xian suddenly opened his eyes. I'm not in a good mood today, so I don't want to talk. Goodbye. It was the first time Haitang had seen Fan Xian so cold, but she didn't react. She simply left the room. Fan Xian lay on the large bed. He was clearly very tired, but he still could not fall asleep. His expression appeared calm, but his mind was a mess. Without enough time, he could not digest what he had heard and felt last night. He opened his bright eyes and looked at the embroidered canopy on top of the bed. His gaze seemed to pierce through the ceiling, straight through the clouds, and cast into the farthest sky. Now that they had confirmed that Fan Xian was in the diplomatic mission, Northern Qi naturally wondered who had tried to rescue Xiao En from the precipice of Mount Yen. This question was naturally raised. Lang Tiao, Friar He, and Shen Zhong sat on 3 chairs, their brows furrowed. Of the 3, Shen Zhong had the highest rank, but Lang Tiao was Ku He's first disciple and the young emperor's martial arts teacher, so he had the highest rank. Friar He, on the other hand, was silent. Yesterday, after the 2 of them had worked together to force Fan Xian and Xiao En off the cliff, the brocade guard had begun a secret search outside Shangjing. Unexpectedly, a day and a night had passed without any result. In the morning, when they finally couldn't resist asking for help from the palace to force their way into the diplomatic mission, they found Fan Xian sitting on the bed. Is it not Fan Xian? Friar He's pale face turned even paler. The poison on his thigh had been purged, but it had also cost him a lot of energy. Lang Tiao closed his eyes and said, "That person must be Fan Xian. He is good at using poison and needles. Other than him, who else could it be?" Friar He frowned. "But that person looks different from Fan Xian." Lang Tiao opened his eyes and said, "People can be disguised." Lang Tiao's status was special, so when he spoke, no one doubted him. But in reality, Fan Xian was perfectly fine in the diplomatic mission. If he had been the one who had fallen off the cliff, how could he have remained in one piece? Unless he was an immortal. Shen Zhong couldn't help but doubt Lang Tiao's judgment. But on the surface, he maintained the benevolent countenance of a wealthy old man. The most likely culprit is Fan Xian, because Shang Shanhu is colluding with a southerner. Only a southerner would know so much about this matter. It can't be one of the aces of Dongyi. Seeing Friar He shake his head in disagreement, Shen Zhong chuckled. Of course, it could be someone else. Other than Fan Xian, who else could it be? Lang Tiao said in a low voice. He didn't like dealing with the heads of secret agents. If it weren't for the fact that Xiao En was involved, he wouldn't have left the palace to help the brocade guard. Shen Zhong glanced at Lang Tiao. With a face full of smiles, he said, "Sir Lang Tiao, the Qing kingdom also has many aces. As for the problem of methods, I think you have heard that there has always been an assassin by Qin Pingping's side called the Shadow. However, no one has seen him, and no one knows his methods and style of doing things. Since Fan Xian is the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, then he must have some connection to the Shadow's methods. If that's the case, then the one who attacked the cliff was not Fan Xian, but the Shadow. The Shadow was Qin Pingping's bodyguard. Although no one had ever seen him, as the head of the Northern Qi secret agents, Shen Zhong naturally knew of his existence. It doesn't matter who it was. Friar He sighed. The most important thing right now is to confirm whether or not Xiao En is dead. Xiao En is dead, Lang Tiao said calmly. When the black-clothed Fan Xian attacked to save Xiao En, Lang Tiao turned around and stabbed his curved knife into Xiao En's abdomen. He was very confident that the force of the knife's tip had cut off Xiao En's life in that instant. Shen Zhong smiled. That's good. The Imperial Advisor and the Empress Dowager will be very satisfied. I thank you both. Once again, the sun was about to sink below the western city wall of Shangjing. Just like every day for thousands of years, the slightly hot wind swirled around the slightly withered leaves and crashed into the various houses in Shangjing. It swirled past people's bodies and swept past the silent tree trunks. After nightfall, the wind gradually cooled. Fan Xian wore an unlined robe and stood next to a tree in the rear courtyard of the diplomatic mission. His eyes narrowed as he watched the first star appear on the horizon. In this weather, he didn't need to wear an unlined robe, but his body was too tired, so he was a little afraid of the cold. He carefully folded the letter in his hand. He didn't use the strength of his palms to shatter it like he usually did. Because this letter was not a secret letter from the council. It was just an ordinary letter from home. The letter was written by Wan Er. Although news from home had been continuously spreading to the north, this was the first time Fan Xian had received a letter from his wife. Presumably, she had been waiting at home a little anxiously. His father-in-law, the Prime Minister, had already stepped down, and Debao had already been brought to Fan Manor. Ruoro was as calm as usual, as if she hadn't been disturbed by the rumors of marriage. His father was busy with court affairs. These were all the contents of the letter. At the end of the letter, there was nothing about longing, nor was there any urging of a certain person's journey. There were only a few lines. The summer night wind has stopped, and I am troubled in my dreams. I know that you will not return, and my black hair grows longer. How long has it been since we parted? Thinking of you is like 3 days. Why have you come? To bury your head in your books. Thinking of you is like 3 days. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Fan Xian smiled. He could feel the faint longing in the letter, and the woman's rare relaxed mood. He felt a little comforted. These days, he had been busy with many conspiracies, and inevitably his longing for the woman at home had faded. Occasionally, when he thought of her, he felt a little guilty. He and Haitang had arranged to meet the day after tomorrow, and for some reason, he was now looking forward to this meeting. This was definitely not a problem between a man and a woman, it was just a very pure kind of hope. Fan Xian wanted to find someone to talk to. More accurately, after his conversation with Xiaoan, he needed to talk, but there was no one to talk to. This strange and wonderful feeling lingered in his heart. On that rainy night in the capital of the kingdom of Qing, after the chest had been opened, Fan Xian had thought that he would no longer be lonely in this world. After all, the smell and traces of that woman were everywhere in this world. But now he truly felt that he was still lonely, because that woman had already disappeared without a trace. Xiaoan was right. I really am a heartless person, Fan Xian thought to himself. Fan Xian thought to himself that he was a man without friends. He shook his head and walked into the side room. There were only 3 people in the room: Fan Xian, Yan Bingyun, and Wang Qinian. This was the last internal meeting of the Overwatch Council in Shangjing. Yan Bingyun looked at Fan Xian calmly. Master Fan, have you gotten anything out of him? This was a situation that Fan Xian had already anticipated. He had used all the power of the Overwatch Council and Xinyang to obtain such a clever death trap. As an official of the Kingdom of Qing, everyone was naturally eager to know what secret Xiaoan was talking about. He frowned. I acted too late. Xiaoan is dead. A strange look flashed through Yan Bingyun's eyes, but he immediately returned to normal. He shook his head and sighed. I've planned for so long, but nothing has come of it. What a pity. Fan Xian smiled mockingly. The old cripple has been working for 20 years, and still hasn't gotten anything out of him. Do you think I'm an immortal? In his conversations with Yan Bingyun, he would purposely refer to Chen Pingping as an old cripple. This was a very impulsive, even clumsy threat. But when dealing with someone as intelligent as Yan Bingyun, this kind of impulsive method was often more effective. He turned his head to Wang Qinian. Prepare for the return journey. Yes, sir. replied Wang Qinian in a low voice. He paused for a moment, then frowned. Master, what do we do with the impostor who was left in the room yesterday? Fan Xian knew that he meant to silence him, and he felt a little uncomfortable. Bring him back, of course. Yan Bingyun shook his head in disapproval. What if the Northern Qi people find out? What if they find out? Fan Xian stared at Yan Bingyun's face and said mockingly. Of course, we'll do nothing. Even if they find out, what can they do? You've been locked up for a year and your courage has shrunk. Yan Bingyun and Wang Qinian looked at each other. They realized that Fan Xian was in a bad mood today, and so they tacitly kept their mouths shut. Fan Xian looked at the two of them and suddenly sighed. Do you think Haiteng can't tell? She just can't do anything to me. Wang Qinian then asked for instructions on the return journey. Fan Xian was silent for a moment, then slowly said, Once the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet is over, we'll leave immediately. I'm a little homesick. Chapter 246. Wang Qinian accepted the order and was about to leave to make the arrangements, as well as discuss the matter with Lin Wen and Lin Jing. After all, the diplomatic mission was to bring along the noble princess. Suddenly, he heard Fan Xian say, The horses we prepared on the way here, Wang Qinian, you must take care of them. Do not cause any trouble for the farmers. Yan Bingyun had not participated in the initial plan, so he did not understand. Wang Qinian looked at Fan Xian. Fan Xian waved his hand and he pushed open the door and left. Yan Bingyun raised his eyebrows. The three of them made 3 gestures, each with its own meaning. Fan Xian smiled. Why do you have to endure so much in front of me? Yan Bingyun did not smile. He slowly raised the teacup in front of him and took a sip. With the respect of a subordinate, he said, Since the commissioner does not want me to know, no matter how curious I am, there is no need for me to ask. Fan Xian did not think too much about it. This was only the initial plan. Since it has been abandoned, of course I have to clean it up. Then, he used very simple words to explain to Yan Bingyun that when Fan Xian had just entered spring, he had found a young official of the Overwatch Council who looked similar to him in the capital. Then, he had kept him in his boudoir. In the initial plan, this impersonator was supposed to play a role on the journey back from Northern Qi. He was supposed to pretend to be Fan Xian and follow the diplomatic mission south, while the real Fan Xian stayed in Shangjing to take care of matters that needed to be taken care of. You originally planned to stay in Shangjing alone? Yan Bingyun frowned. What matters were you going to take care of? Fan Xian looked at him and said, Chen Pingping wants Xiao En dead, so I plan to stay in Shangjing and kill him, then rush to the border to meet up with the diplomatic mission. That way, if Xiao En dies, the Northern Qi people won't be able to pull a fast one and slaughter our diplomatic mission. Yan Bingyun asked, You were talking to Sir Wang about the horses along the way? Fan Xian smiled and explained, Before the diplomatic mission departed from the capital, I had already asked some people in the council and some people in the palace treasury to help raise some good horses for the journey south. Of course, these horses were all secretly kept in the stable, so they wouldn't alert the Northern Qi officials. After you kill Xiao En in Shangjing, you change horses all the way and rush to the border as fast as you can? Yan Bingyun sneered. Riding alone for 1,000 miles? Is there a problem? Yan Bingyun sighed. This is the real world, not a novel. If we had followed the original plan and you killed Xiao En, Northern Qi would have closed Shangjing, and the armies of the various provinces would have sealed off the roads leading south. How could you have gotten back south on your own? Fan Xian smiled and said, Back then, Chen Pingping was able to bring so many people back to the south. Why can't I do it alone? You might have been brave, but the plan was stupid. Yan Bingyun shook his head. You are the commissioner of the council, and you should value your life. And in this plan, even if Northern Qi relaxed their guard because of the diplomatic mission's departure, you couldn't have assassinated Xiao En in Shangjing, where there were so many hidden dragons and crouching tigers. Fan Xian naturally wouldn't tell this man about the anti-sniper rifle. After all, Wu Zhu was missing, the chest was missing, the eldest princess was in cahoots with Shang Shanhu, and little Xian had reaped the rewards. Things had changed again, and the plan had become what it was now. Tomorrow was the day after tomorrow. Of course, this was nonsense. Shangjing's beautiful Yuchuan River was lush with green trees. Occasionally, egrets flew up from the north. This was already upstream of the river, close to the royal palace, so it was strictly guarded. The common people of Shangjing had no way to set foot on these cobblestone paths. Fan Xian and Haitang walked side by side on the riverbank, talking nonsense here and there. He didn't feel depressed, and his mood, which had been gloomy for the past few days, seemed to have improved greatly in the company of the village girl. Strangely enough, Haitang wasn't very pretty, and her grace wasn't very charming. She had the air of a village girl, but this feeling made Fan Xian feel at ease. After a few words of nonsense, the conversation immediately turned to business. Haitang frowned slightly. The Empress Dowager still hasn't relented. Can you think of any way? Fan Xian sighed. Your emperor wants to marry a wife, and yet he wants my help. He suddenly looked at Haitang, his calm eyes containing a trace of displeasure. Since you are Sea Lily's good friend, of course you know some things. Don't you think that asking for my help would make her feel uncomfortable? Haitang's hands were in her pockets, and her feet were dragging on the bluestone ground by the riverbank. Her eyes were calm as she looked at the drooping willow tree in front of them. If you could do what Sea Lily wanted, then she wouldn't have come to Shangjing. Since you are a heartless person, why be so pretentious? I think her entering the palace is something you want to see. After all, from now on, even if you are far away in the south, you will have someone to talk to in the palace of Northern Qi. Fan Xian had never expected her to tell him everything so thoroughly, not giving him a chance to hide anything. His heart trembled and he was a little embarrassed. He felt as if the thin layer of clothing on his body had been stripped off, revealing the selfishness and heartless beneath. After a moment of silence, he smiled bitterly. I am only an official. I don't have enough power to change everything. So you tacitly allowed this to happen. Haitang's tone wasn't aggressive, but there was an inexplicable sense of oppression in her open and above-board manner. If that's the case, there's no need to say more. Fan Xian shook his head. Once she enters the palace, her hair will turn white. You and Sea Lily are sisters. How could you bear to see her enter the palace? His Majesty is a good man. Haitang smiled. And Lily is a citizen of Qing. If she wants to live in Shangjing, it seems that only the palace can shelter her from the wind and rain. Suddenly, Haitang turned her head, and Fan Xian saw a spirit in her eyes that was even brighter than the light of the lake. In Fan Xian's life, the brightest eyes were Yi Ling and Haitang, but Yi Ling eyes were bright and innocent, and Haitang's eyes were bright and full of understanding and indifference after seeing through the affairs of the world. Master Fan, don't you find it tiring to live a life of scheming all day long? Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. After a moment, he resolutely raised his head and put his hands behind his back. His upper body didn't move, but his lower body moved slightly. Like Haitang, he swayed on the bluestone path by the river. He spoke abruptly. In this world, not everyone can be as free and unfettered as you, because each of us has our own goals. Perhaps you just want to grow a few good vegetables and take care of the fields. But I have to think for myself, for the people around me, for the present and for the future. Having said this, he took out a letter and handed it to Haitang. I'm not a man of great wisdom. At most, I'm a little clever. Take a look and see if this method works. Haitang opened the letter and read it carefully in the daylight. After a long silence, she took a deep breath and looked at Fan Xian with her bright eyes. There was a strange look in them. Will the Empress Dowager believe me? If the Empress Dowager doesn't want to fall out with the Emperor because of this, then all she needs is face and a way out. Whether she believes me or not, these two things will be convincing enough. Fan Xian's plan was actually very simple. In the history of that world, he remembered clearly how Emperor Wu of Han had been hooked by Lady Go Yi. At that time, Emperor Wu was patrolling Hejian. Suddenly, a magician claimed that there were auspicious clouds there, indicating that there must be an extraordinary woman living there. After hearing this, Emperor Wu immediately ordered a search, and indeed, the beautiful girl was found. However, although she was beautiful, she had been ill since childhood. She rarely ate, and her hands were clenched into fists. No one could make her stretch them. Emperor Wu was captivated by her beauty and personally tried to bend her fist. Then, a miracle happened. Her hands easily recovered to their healthy state. Even stranger was that in her right hand, there was still a small jade hook tightly clenched. Emperor Wu was very happy. He immediately brought her into the palace and gave her the title of Lady Fist. Later, she became Lady Go Yi. Who is this emperor you're talking about? Haiteng asked. Fan Xian smiled. It's a story I made up. He paused and said, of course it's fake. Emperor Wu of Han is not an idiot. Maybe he came up with this. Haiteng was a little naive when it came to matters between men and women. She hesitantly asked, then what should we do? Fan Xian shook his head in annoyance. Who are you? He asked. Haiteng subconsciously fell into silence. Fan Xian was startled. He wondered if this girl, who wanted to study the way of heaven, had been dragged into a philosophical problem. He quickly coughed and said, you are Ku He's disciple, and Ku He is the imperial advisor. If Ku He said that there were auspicious clouds in the west of the capital, and that there was an extraordinary woman beneath them, it would be much more convincing. Haiteng smiled bitterly. Why would Master play along with me? Fan Xian snorted in his heart. Your master dared to eat human flesh, and has always doted on you. It's not too much to play along with you. Haiteng continued to ask, but everyone in Shangjing knows Lily's identity. It's impossible to hide it. Fan Xian smiled. Take Miss C to the Temple of Qi for a few months. It would be best if she could become a nun. What does that mean? She worships the temple wholeheartedly, and does not think of marriage. And then, when the matter has died down, she will be sent to the palace. What is done cannot be undone. She will be carved into a ship. That's it? There are some details in the letter. Pay attention. Of course, if you can convince the imperial advisor to take Miss C as a disciple, that would be even better. Master Fan, these suggestions seem absurd and ridiculous, but if you look at them carefully, they are indeed feasible. Haiteng bowed slightly and thanked Fan Xian. Fan Xian couldn't help but smile. This was the successful experience of Wu Zetian and Yang Guifei from his previous life. Of course it was feasible. Of course it was feasible. But there was still a big question in his heart. Why did the Emperor want Si Lily to enter the palace? Why did the Empress Dowager not allow her to enter the palace? Haiteng must know the secret, but she certainly would not tell it to an official from another court. Suddenly, Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat. He thought of the young emperor's demeanor when he entered the palace a few times. He couldn't help but have an extremely absurd and daring idea. Chapter 247. Naturally, Fan Xian would not tell the girl beside him what he was thinking. He just unconsciously sucked in a breath of cold air, as if he had a toothache. Haiteng glanced at him and said nothing. She continued to walk along the Yuchuan River. After walking for a short while, she came to the outskirts of a small garden. The bamboo fence was the door, the well was at the side of the courtyard, and the stone table was under the shade of the west. yellow, mottled chicks were silently making a fortune from rice. This was, of course, where Haiteng grew vegetables. Fan Xian shook his head helplessly. People can't be compared to each other. To be honest, Miss has always put on an act of being close to nature, but compared to the stinking pigsty in the village, this elegant place, only now do I know that planting vegetables and raising chickens also need to pay attention to the realm. These words were clear praise, but they were actually derogatory. Haiteng only smiled and said, "Do you think I'm happy to stay in Shangjing? But my teacher has orders, and the palace has a request, so I can only ask for a quiet garden nearby." Fan Xian laughed. "I'm afraid that Xinzhong and the others plotted this garden for you to grow vegetables. What kind of good people and rich gentry did they harm?" Haiteng said, "That is what I do not know and cannot control." She spoke indifferently, and Fan Xian also listened indifferently. This was one of the things he admired about Haiteng. As a transcendent figure in northern Qi, she did not forcefully pretend to be a fairy. She was not sour, not impatient, not deliberately indifferent. She just followed her heart, which was good. Before the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet, there was a rare moment of leisure. Fan Xian temporarily cast aside the gloomy mood of these days. He rolled up his sleeves and rolled up his trousers. He took out some tools from behind the grindstone and began to help Haiteng turn the soil. After the delicate yellow soil was turned, he scooped up a bowl of millet. Like a greedy dragon king, he stingily scattered it on the ground bit by bit, making the chicks squeak and follow his footsteps as they ran around the little courtyard. Haiteng crouched down to tidy up the branches and leaves of the fruit. She smiled as she watched Fan Xian play. Her gaze would occasionally land on his left leg. Halfway through, Fan Xian was tired and a little hot. He picked up a bucket of water from the well and stuck his head in to drink a few mouthfuls. Just as he was about to touch the surface of the water, he glanced at Haiteng out of the corner of his eye. He found that the girl was very skilled at tending to the vegetable beds. She must have done this often these past few years. Fan Xian had never done farming since he was in Danzhou. Holding a hoe in his hand was not as comfortable as holding a dagger. When he was watering, it was not as refreshing as it was when he sprinkled poison. Clumsily, in the end, he was reduced to a spectator. Even so, he was so tired that his forehead was covered in sweat, and steam rose from his head. As the sun rose higher into the sky, Haiteng moved 2 reclining chairs and placed them under the trellis. Hanging on the trellis was some kind of melon or fruit. The leaves were huge and glossy green, blocking out all the sunlight. Fan Xian let out a breath of hot air and sat down on the reclining chair. He bluntly accepted the herbal tea Haiteng handed him, drank a few mouthfuls, and then fell back down, causing the chair to creak. He closed his eyes and began to take an afternoon nap, relaxing as if he were in his own home. Haiteng looked at him and smiled. She pulled off the flower scarf on her head and wiped the sweat from her forehead, then lay down as well. 2 bamboo chairs and a green canopy, a cool breeze, and 2 idle people. After some time, Haiteng suddenly broke the silence. "You really are a strange person. You are also a strange person." Fan Xian's eyes were still closed. "At least, up until now, I have not been able to see through you." As the two spoke, they had already dropped the honorifics of Sir Fan and Sir. Haiteng felt a little more comfortable. She smiled. "Why must you see through someone? And what do you mean by see through? Everyone does certain things for a certain purpose." A smile rose to the corner of Fan Xian's mouth. "And I do not know what your purpose is." "My purpose?" Haiteng fanned herself with the flower scarf. "Why must one live with a purpose?" Fan Xian closed his eyes. He stretched out a finger and shook it. "Living is not about having a purpose. Everything we do, everything we want to achieve, is for the sake of living." Haiteng said, "I'm not used to talking in circles like this. I'm just talking nonsense, that's all." Fan Xian stretched. "I really like talking nonsense with you." It's a feeling that allows me to convince myself that I am indeed living, and not being controlled by the purpose of living. Haiteng spat. You're still talking nonsense. I just like your way of doing things. After saying this, Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh. People like you and I, who have no friends, always want to find someone to talk to. Sir Fan, your talent is unparalleled, and your name is world-shaking. How can you not have friends? For some reason, Haiteng returned to calling him Sir. Fan Xian fell silent. After a while he said, I truly have no friends. And you are a proud son of Northern Qi. You and I are in opposing camps, but I feel that I can treat you as a friend. After all, when I was in Northern Qi, you couldn't have killed me. Haiteng glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. This official from the south was so pretty that he was indeed a bit of a bastard. Sir, you are of noble birth. After entering the capital, you have flourished. Your life has been straightforward, your career unhindered. The monarchs of both countries value you. What is there to be dissatisfied with? Lonely. Lonely. Fan Xian didn't seem to think that these two words were a bit pretentious and nauseating. Haiteng laughed. Sir Fan, you have someone as powerful as Yan Bingyun under your command. In the south, you are a powerful official of the Overwatch Council. You have a beautiful wife, and your sister is a famous talented woman. Your father is in a high position, and the people you associate with are all outstanding. How can you be lonely? A father is a father, a wife is a wife, and a sister is a sister. Yan Bingyun is a subordinate, and the people I associate with all have conflicts of interest. Fan Xian didn't know why he was so magnanimous in front of Haiteng. You can think of me as pretending to be lonely or pretending to be desperate. In any case, my position as an official is not easy, and my son is not happy either. Haiteng's eyes were as bright as the sky. Sir Fan, could it be that you want to be friends with me? Let's not talk about friends for now, Fan Xian said. At least staying with you is more relaxing. This is an enjoyment that is hard to come by for me. What if I have other plans for you? You won't, Fan Xian replied with great confidence. Sir, you seem to have forgotten that there is enmity between us. It doesn't matter. At least right now, if someone wants to kill me, you will certainly help me. Fan Xian's long-hidden weariness finally revealed some of it. Sir Fan, I've always been curious. Why? Why were you willing to come to Northern Qi? Haiteng looked at him with a smile. Actually, the affairs of the southern officialdom were no secret in the north. Of course, she knew about the mysteries and the relationship between the emperor's family. Fan Xian laughed. I'm not telling you. Haiteng was speechless. Fan Xian turned over and got off the deck chair. He stretched. I'm hungry. Haiteng replied. There is rice in the house, water in the well, and vegetables in the garden. You can make it yourself. Fan Xian sighed. When a man says to any woman other than his wife that he is hungry, he is usually saying that the liquor bug in his stomach is hungry. The most luxurious, quiet, and well-organized restaurant in Shangjing was the Centenary Pine House. Today, an honored guest had arrived. This guest was quite expensive, so the owner of the Centenary Pine House personally waited outside. He respectfully asked all the guests to leave, leaving behind a spacious and quiet 3-story building. The owner of the restaurant was naturally surprised, but the owner did not explain. He was also a high-ranking person with informants in the court. He had long seen through the identity of the man and woman. The man was the immortal poet of the southern court, and the woman was the emperor's aunt. The two of them together were characters who could take a stroll on the stone streets of the palace, let alone a restaurant. In a private room facing the street, Fan Xian squinted at the scenery as he poured wine into his mouth. After drinking 3 cups, he frowned and called for the owner to come in for a change. The owner saw that his complexion was not good, and immediately gave up on the idea of asking for the immortal poet's calligraphy. He went to Northern Chi's most famous green rice. Fan Xian took a sip and nodded. Haitang was a little annoyed. Before, it was Wuliangye, the best liquor in the world. Is Master Fan not satisfied? I do like to drink strong liquor. Fan Xian turned his head to look at her. His expression was a little strange. But right now, I don't want to drink Wuliangye, because there's something else about it. I can't relax too much. Wuliangye had the taste of Qingyu Hall, the taste of Yi, and the taste of Fan Xian. He didn't like it today. Haitang fell silent again. She just watched Fan Xian drink. Her eyes grew brighter and brighter, as if she was enjoying something very interesting. As he got tipsy, Fan Xian's eyes became a little hazy, and his smile became more relaxed. Don't you think I've lived a happy life, and yet I'm pretending to drown my sorrows in wine? Is that funny? Young people don't know the taste of sorrow. Fan Xian tapped his chopsticks on the bowl and sang. This was the first poem he had copied since his reincarnation. Now that he thought back to the past, he felt even more complicated. He sang softly again. Stay in Qing, suddenly meet my benefactor. Fortunately, mother, accumulated a shady merit. Advise life, help the needy and help the poor. Don't be like my evil uncle and treacherous brother, who love money and forget his own flesh and blood. It is multiplication, division, addition and subtraction, above the firmament. This was the verdict of Sister Qiao in Dream of the Red Chamber, Leave Yu Qing. Haitang's eyes shone even brighter. Fan Xian let out a long sigh. He raised his cup and drained it in one gulp. Miss Haitang, don't mind me. Just let me get drunk. Why should I get drunk? There were many reasons why a man wanted to drink. The most adequate reason was that he was depressed and under pressure. On this trip to Northern Qi, Fan Xian had obtained the secret of the temple, forged the friendship between the two countries, and successfully gathered the spy network in the north. No matter how one looked at it, it was a beautiful spring day. Why was he so gloomy? Where did that pressure come from? It was actually very simple. He was gloomy because he had nowhere to go. Fan Xian had told Xiao En in the cave that he was a passerby in this world, and so he had always viewed this world as a tourist. Even after 18 years of ups and downs, he still felt somewhat estranged from this world. If there was no Wanner, if there was no sister, if there was no Wu Zhu, Fan Xian would have wanted nothing more than to be free and go to the world to enjoy himself. The pressure came from the conversation in the cave. Qin Pingping had made Fan Xian set his sights higher, even higher than the world. After Fan Xian found out where the temple was, he began to understand. He began to bear this pressure alone. And this secret, which concerned the world, had squeezed Xiao En for decades. Who knew how long it would continue to squeeze Fan Xian? If he went to the temple, of course, he would die 100 times and survive. What about the people he wanted to protect? If he did not go, he would never know what had happened in the past. Fan Xian was very angry. Before he knew, he wanted nothing more than to dig Xiao En's head open. Now that he knew, he wished he never knew. Originally, for the sake of safety, he should have returned to the capital and enjoyed a few years of glory in the officialdom and the business world, and buried the matter of the temple forever in his heart. But he was always somewhat unwilling, so he somewhat hated himself for thinking so much about Yi Qingmei, and the mother of this body, so he did not want to drink the 5-grain liquor. He even looked at the glass in his hand and felt the urge to throw it to the ground and shatter it. The verdict given to Qiao Jie in Dream of the Red Chamber really seemed to be written for him. Fortunately, he had been reborn, fortunately, he had met his benefactor, fortunately, he had his mother who had accumulated a shady skill, allowing him to easily and effortlessly obtain a large sum of wealth and the help of a large group of powerful people. What should he do in the remaining years of his life? Haitang's bright eyes seemed to be able to see through a person's heart. She slowly said, "Advise life, help the needy and comfort the poor." Fan Xian was startled awake. Although he knew that even if he was dead drunk, he could not reveal his secrets in front of anyone, but why would Haitang say this? In truth, Haitang had only said this by chance. She looked at Fan Xian's slightly deranged expression and thought of the legendary banquet in the palace of the Southern Dynasty, when the immortal of poetry first appeared in the world. She thought that Fan Xian's path of life had been set, and endless prosperity had come along the way, but he had developed a world-weary and decadent heart. This kind of situation was very common in scholars, so Haitang had said this quietly, purely from the bottom of her heart. She wanted to advise Fan Xian to wholeheartedly serve the people of the world. Because Haitang had always believed that Fan Xian was, in his bones, a scholar. The world is bustling with activity, all for the sake of profit, Fan Xian said mockingly. Miss Haitang cultivates the way of the gods. She is close to nature and cherishes the people, but she does not know that they only want profit. I have no ambition to open up new territories, and I also want the people of the world to live a bit more comfortably. But that must be me first. But to let the people live a bit more comfortably, I must hold power in my hand. But in the court of this world, if you want to hold a high position, how can you live comfortably? Haitang heard the cold intent in his words and was slightly startled. Master Fan, you hold power in your hands. Please remember the word righteousness. Too vulgar, too vulgar. Fan Xian knocked his chopsticks against the ground, but the porcelain bowl did not shatter. How many people are different from animals? Haitang continued to frown. Only righteousness is in the ears of the people. Although Master Fan and I live in different countries, the people of the world, whether the people of the kingdom of Qing or the people of the kingdom of Qi, are all unique creatures. If you still have any reverence for the word righteousness, I hope that after you return to your country, you will do your best to stop the world from fighting again. Stopping the world from fighting, this was Haitang's goal, the goal that Fan Xian had always guessed. It was a very large memorial archway. If someone else had said it, they would have found it disgusting. But coming from Haitang, it seemed very natural and easy to believe. Fan Xian laughed mockingly. Then Shao'an is not a living creature? Haitang said, killing one Shao'an can save tens of thousands of people. Why not? If Shao'an escaped from prison and joined forces with Shang Shanhu and his son, his imperial power would soar. Then he would spit out the secret of the temple. With the ambitions of the young emperor of northern Qi, the world would probably be plunged into the fires of war in a few years. So what she said made some sense. Fan Xian had no awareness of a politician or a moralist. He laughed coldly. If 100 people have to die, kill 49 and live 51. Will you kill them or not? Haitang was silent for a long time. So, you and I are both heartless. Fan Xian suddenly did not want to talk about such uninteresting topics, and rather stiffly changed the subject. How different are humans from animals? Good at pretending. Haitang raised her head in surprise. Fan Xian said, my martial cultivation is not as good as yours. But if we were to fight to the death, you might not be able to kill me so easily. Haitang nodded. Fan Xian drank a cup of wine and looked into her eyes. Why? He said quietly. Because I am good at using all the tools I have. In martial cultivation, the most important thing is to cultivate the heart. The power of external objects cannot be relied on for long, Haitang replied quietly. Fan Xian shook his head. Those who value righteousness do not necessarily use it to their fullest potential. Those who seek profit do not necessarily lack righteousness. Righteousness is great profit. As long as the goal is correct, why care about the means? After saying this, Fan Xian was stunned. This small talk was meant to divert the topic, but it had inadvertently touched upon his own heart. It was like a ray of light had suddenly struck his heart, and he immediately understood what his true feelings were. A heartless person? Perhaps he was a sentimental person at heart. All his life, He had always said that he wanted to live well, but he never knew how to live well. Today, he finally had a chance. At this moment, his heart was sober, but his eyes were strong with alcohol. He stared at Haitang and slowly said 2 words. "Thank you." Haitang was at a complete disadvantage in terms of words today, but it was not like he Shiran. Hearing the word "thank you," she felt a little lost in her heart. Looking at the determination in Fan Xian's drunken eyes, she suddenly felt a little uneasy. She thought for a moment and her eyes became clearer. "Given your talent, the South will be a good stage in the future. Since you do not wish to fight, you are my friend. I hope that when you rise to the 1,000 mountains, you will be careful and think of the people. Do not have the slightest complacency. This is the right path." Fan Xian gently placed his wine cup on the table and said quietly, "Don't worry, I have just started." Other than Ku He, Haitang was the #1 ace in Northern Qi. With such a beautiful woman guarding him, all of the hesitation in his heart was dispelled. Fan Xian drank to his heart's content. Although he was a bit childish and refused to drink Wuliangya, he had drunk too much green rice. In the end, his throat was dry and spicy, his chest swelled, and his mind was muddled. He floated back to his senses and happily collapsed on the table. This was the first time since Fan Xian had opened the chest that he had become so drunk that he had lost consciousness. It was in a restaurant in the enemy country of Shangjing, and in front of Haitang, who he did not know was friend or foe. Acting like this was really old-fashioned and stupid. "You really are a person who cannot be seen through." Haitang looked at Fan Xian, who had collapsed on the table and was sleeping sweetly like a child. She smiled. "I have always wanted to see Sir Shuaqin." Chapter 248. Fan Xian's head hurt a little. A pair of warm and soft hands reached out and gently rubbed his temples. He was slightly startled, but his eyes were still closed as he asked, "Where is this place?" Perhaps it was because he had drunk too much, but his voice sounded dry. He felt the hands on his temples leave his hands, and a moment later, a cup was carefully brought to his lips. He tasted it and found it was honey of the right thickness, perfect for dispelling alcohol. He couldn't help but smile. He believed that Haitang wouldn't poison him, because that wouldn't do her any good. Just as he was thinking about this, he suddenly smelled a faint fragrance around him. This fragrance was extremely elegant, but it caused ripples in his heart. A wave of heat rose from his lower abdomen, directly messing up his mind. The fragrance drew closer, softly resting against the back of his head. The enchanting collision of bodies made the fire in Fan Xian's heart unbearable. Fan Xian abruptly opened his eyes. There was a lingering desire in the serenity in his eyes. Looking at the pair of white jade wrists in front of him and the light green sleeves, he said, "Lily?" Lily turned around. Her body went limp and she fell into his arms. Her eyes gazed at him weakly. There was a glimmer of hope and a trace of hidden bitterness. The two of them had been traveling north, and the only thing they hadn't broken through was that layer of paper. Fan Xian smelled the familiar scent of a woman, and he couldn't help but be absent-minded. After he came to Shangjing, he had only seen her once in the temple. He had already decided not to have too much of a relationship with this woman, but now that when you had thrown herself into his arms, that familiar and soft touch kept rubbing against his chest and abdomen. He had just been drinking with Haitang, and now he was being intimate with Lily. Of course, Fan Xian understood what was going on, but he didn't quite understand. It's not that I don't understand, but the world changes quickly. In the early summer of Shangjing, when there was no wind, it would be hot and stuffy. When there was no rain, there would be dust. It really couldn't be called a good time. Fortunately, it was already late. A light night breeze swept past, freeing the little temple from the scorching heat of the day. Sparse branches hung from the eaves of the temple, and a large, round moon was reflected in the distant but also very close background of the night sky. Fan Xian fastened his belt and ran out of the room like a perverted thief. His handsome face was filled with disbelief and absurdity. At the entrance of the temple, he suddenly turned around and looked at the woman sitting on the full moon on top of the temple. He cursed, "You're the same as your master, you're both crazy." Fan Xian had always liked to disguise himself. He was shy, sweet, and naive. Although no one believed him, he was still pure. But today, he had encountered of such absurdity. He was shocked and angry, and he finally opened his mouth to curse. Haiteng squatted on the roof like a nanny watching over children in love. She did not tie the floral scarf on her head, but around her neck. She looked like a captain from another world. She did not seem to think that Fan Xian would wake up so quickly. Her face was full of surprise, but a faint shyness and a smile flashed through her eyes. A moment later, she said quietly, "So fast." After Fan Xian's anger, he was immediately dumbfounded. What kind of woman was she? Haiteng seemed to immediately understand. She patted her head with some self-blame. "How could I forget that you are Fei Jie's disciple? If I had known earlier, I would have increased the dosage when I drugged you." The moonlight moved slightly, and the sparse branches trembled. Haiteng floated down without stirring up a speck of dust. She landed lightly by Fan Xian's side. She turned her head and looked at the inner room with a smile. She pushed open the temple door and signaled for Fan Xian to go out with her. Outside the temple, it was completely dark. In the distance, frogs croaked from the pond. It was a farmhouse atmosphere, but Fan Xian's heart was filled with resentment. He coldly asked, "What drug did you give me?" "Aphrodisiac," Haiteng said matter-of-factly. "The best kind in the palace." "You." Fan Xian stretched out his index finger and pointed at her nose, which was straighter than most women's. He felt the urge to smash her nose. "I am an envoy of the kingdom of Qing. She will soon be your emperor's woman. How dare you?" Haiteng's face immediately grew cold. "Master Fan, when you drugged me by wudu, why didn't you feel like you were a coward? Then we were enemies. Today we are friends. How could that be?" Fan Xian immediately seemed less confident. Haiteng smiled. "When we were in the palace, what did you say?" "Many days ago, in the palace. The antidote you gave me last time was too much orange peel. It was a bit bitter." Haiteng was intoxicated by the sunlight. Fan Xian smiled. He knew that she had seen through his tricks that day. He said quietly, "I am the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. I am not a sage who seeks the way of heaven. It is normal for me to use some tricks. I hope you do not mind. Of course, if you do mind, you can also give me that drug." These words were a bit frivolous, but Haiteng did not blush like other women. She said lightly, "If there is a chance, I will naturally use it. If there is a chance, I will naturally use it. If there is a chance, I will naturally use it." Fan Xian, with his amazing memory, of course remembered this sentence clearly. He did not expect that as a woman she would actually use it. He could not help but snort coldly. He was angry, but there was nothing he could do. He had let someone else drug him, and someone else had drugged him at his request. It seemed that there was nothing he could say. And so, Fan Xian raised his head to look at the moon, and lowered his head to hate the woman. "I am not a sage. I am just a petty woman who holds a grudge." Haiteng laughed. "She was very much a woman. It should not be Sea Lily. You are her sister." Fan Xian looked at Haiteng coldly. "You know what this means. Lily likes you." Haiteng smiled. "You do not dislike Lily, so we sisters think this is possible." Actually, after knowing that Fan Xian was the Mr. Chow who wrote Story of the Stone, Haiteng was even more certain of this idea. Fan Xian suddenly fell silent, thinking of something. After a while, he suddenly looked at Haiteng and said, "Actually, since you drugged me with an aphrodisiac, although you are indeed not a beauty, I can still reluctantly sacrifice myself. Why drag Miss C into this?" No matter how carefree and natural she was, no matter how uninhibited she was, in the end, she was still a young girl. Hearing this, she couldn't help but become angry. Her bright eyes stared fiercely at Fan Xian like a she-wolf in the middle of the night on a wasteland. Fan Xian let out a breath of resentment and immediately recovered his calm. Narrowing his eyes, he said, "I can just pat my butt and leave. Be careful of your teacher punishing you." Haiteng took a deep breath and suppressed her emotions. She said calmly, "I hope you will forgive me for plotting against you today." Fan Xian said expressionlessly, "You can plot against me a few more times. No man would refuse such luck, but you can forget it." Haiteng was no longer angry. She only said quietly, "The day after tomorrow, there will be a banquet in the palace. There will be a martial battle. You should prepare first, sir. After the banquet, I will leave for home." Fan Xian stared at Haiteng's ordinary face. It was strangely strange. "I cannot stay in Shangjing. There are urgent matters at home. Arrange for me to meet with Miss C again." Haiteng bowed slightly and silently agreed. She then watched Fan Xian's figure gradually disappear into the darkness. As he passed by a ridge, Fan Xian stumbled slightly and almost fell. Perhaps it was because he was uneasy, but seeing his hands fumble in his robe, she realized that his belt had not been fastened properly. The immortal of poetry of a generation, the future minister of a generation, the most embarrassing scene of his life, happened inside and outside the most remote temple in Shangjing. Haiteng smiled. Her bright eyes were full of joy. No one knew why she was so happy. Returning to the diplomatic mission, Fan Xian's eyes were serene. He did not look the least bit embarrassed, nor did he show the anger he had earlier. Living in this world, it was difficult to avoid being schemed against by others, unless you were a perfect person who could see through the hearts of others. He did not expect Haiteng to have such a reckless side. He also did not expect her to act so boldly and decisively. This kind of gambler was not much different from his own. Only 4 in total? He had already taken a bath and was half leaning on a chair. But he still smelled a faint fragrance on his body. He could not help but think of that girl, and a faint feeling welled up in his heart. Even though he was a cold and hard person, he could not help but narrow his eyes. He began to calculate how this matter would affect that girl. Perhaps what Haiteng said was true, but what of it? Yan Bingyan frowned and looked at him. Fan Xian was his superior, the official commander of the diplomatic mission. Just as the diplomatic mission was about to leave the kingdom of Qi, he had disappeared without a trace for an entire day. There were many things he could not ask for instructions on. Although the news in the afternoon confirmed that he was having a drinking contest with Haiteng, who rarely appeared in front of people, where did he go? Why did Master Fan look so strange today? Yes. In 4 years, only 4 concubines entered the palace, Yan Bingyan replied. The Northern Qi Emperor has practiced the way of the heavens since he was a child. Looking at his style of governance, he can be considered a wise ruler. Anyone with great ambitions would naturally not be interested in the affairs of men and women. The Northern Qi Emperor should not have any children yet, right? Fan Xian asked with his eyes closed. The Emperor is still young, and the palace is not in a hurry. Not in a hurry? Forget it. Go and have Wang Qinian make arrangements for the palace entry the day after tomorrow, as well as the return trip. Fan Xian snorted in his heart and waved his hand for Yan Bingyan to leave. Yan Bingyan looked at him with some confusion. He knew that the commissioner had many secrets that he had not revealed. It was true that although Fan Xian was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, there were many things he would not tell anyone. For example, tonight's matter, or the possibility of the Northern Qi Emperor being attacked. Fan Xian's fingers were still cold. Only now did he realize that he was not as brave as Haiteng. The main gates of the palace slowly opened. The beautiful palace, hidden in the green mountains, with its black eaves and flowing waterfalls, once again appeared in front of everyone. Fan Xian looked coldly at the unfamiliar Northern Qi officials and calmly walked into the palace. He then greeted Wei Hua and the other officials from the office of the Grand Herald, who he was familiar with, and was politely invited into the Great Hall by a eunuch. The Great Hall was quiet. The clear water beside the long imperial path was calm and unruffled, and the fish in the water swam naturally. The Empress Dowager and the Emperor sat high up on the imperial platform. Below them were a dozen or so tables. The people sitting there were all high-ranking officials of Northern Qi. Ordinary officials only had the right to eat in a side hall. As the head envoy of Qing, Fan Xian sat high up on the first table to the left. Other than Gouda, who was standing steadily behind him, the only other people in the diplomatic mission were Lin Wen and Lin Jing. Sitting opposite the diplomatic mission were the Grand Tutor and the Prime Minister of Northern Qi. Fan Xian glanced at the Grand Tutor. He knew that he was Zhuang Mohan's most famous student. He had not expected him to be so young. After a series of formalities, the birthday banquet finally began. The Empress Dowager of Northern Qi was actually still very young. Although there were some wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, she still had the pure beauty of a noble woman. But Fan Xian knew from the matter with Shaoan that this woman was actually an extremely cruel and merciless person. Thinking of Shaoan, he subconsciously tilted his head. Shang Shanhu was sitting at the table next to him. It was a pity that when he entered the hall, he had not had the opportunity to clearly see the elegance of the foremost general of Northern Qi. The Empress Dowager raised her wine cup and said something. Her voice was very soft and clear. Fan Xian did not pay attention. He just followed the officials in bowing and reciting the words of praise. The Empress Dowager's birthday was a red bomb that the common people could not compare to. The officials of Northern Qi wanted nothing more than to plunder all the precious objects in the world and move them to the palace. The green dragon jade on Dong Mountain, the marvelous bell imported from Dongyi, the rare two-tailed ferret from the snowy lands of the north. The Empress Dowager nodded slightly, seeming quite satisfied. The gifts from the Qing diplomatic mission had long been transported from the capital. Although they were expensive, they were not extraordinary. Naturally, Fan Xian would not actually compose a poem for the Empress Dowager. Otherwise, before the Empress Dowager's face hit the ground, his face would hit the ground first. Furthermore, his calligraphy would not be presentable. His personal birthday gift was a small bottle. Inside the bottle was a clear amber liquid. It looked ordinary, but after the Empress Dowager opened the lid and took a whiff, the look in her eyes when she looked at Fan Xian was not quite right. It was one of admiration and love. Yes, it was a very uncreative perfume. The palace treasury had stopped producing it for 15 years, and Fan Xian had stolen it from Qingyu Hall. He had originally planned to use it to intoxicate Haitang. But he had not expected Haitang to not be into it. He had not expected that Haitang was not a great beauty. When Fan Xian had been preparing Li Qingzhao's poem in the capital, The Water of France, he had not expected that he would not be able to subdue Haitang through the issue of men and women. Instead, he had almost been tricked by her. After Fan Xian thanked the Empress Dowager, he raised his eyes and glanced at the Emperor. Unexpectedly, he found that the young Emperor was also looking at him with a smile. He had long been prejudiced against him. Seeing the Emperor's liking gaze, he could not help but feel his hair stand on end. Chapter 249. Fan Xian's heart trembled, but his face remained respectful. He lowered his eyes, avoiding the young Emperor's gaze, but he was too embarrassed to look at the Empress Dowager. The old faces of the Grand Tutor and the Prime Minister were meaningless, so his gaze naturally fell on the table next to the Grand Tutor. That table was empty. He didn't know which official had not arrived yet. Just as she was thinking, a person walked out from behind a pillar by the Chang Palace pool. He bowed to the Empress Dowager and the Emperor in the hall, and then very naturally sat down at that table. A palace maid had already gone to pour wine. This man was dressed in black. He was tall and slender, full of power. His eyes were as calm as an ancient well, bottomless. The strangest thing was that he wore a chain around his waist. He carried 2 curved knives with him as he entered the hall. This man was quite daring. Fan Xian sucked in a breath of cold air. He tilted his head and asked Lin Jing, "Who is this? To be able to sit next to the Grand Tutor and bring knives into the palace, he must be an incredible person." Lin Jing quietly introduced him. "This is Imperial Advisor Ku He's first disciple, Sir Lang Tiao. He is the commander of the Imperial Guards in the palace, but I've heard that in recent years he has mainly been in charge of the Emperor's martial cultivation. He doesn't really manage affairs." Fan Xian made an "oh" sound as if he had just understood. With a hint of shock, he said, "So this is Miss Haitong's senior disciple. No wonder he has such a high status." At this moment, Lang Tiao's calm gaze had already landed on Fan Xian's face. Fan Xian smiled and raised the wine cup in his hand in a friendly gesture. He gestured to Lang Tiao, his lips slightly parted, and soundlessly said 2 words, "Hello." Lang Tiao frowned. No one knew what he was thinking. After a moment's hesitation, he finally raised the cup in his hand and drank with Fan Xian from a distance. Lin Jing quietly said to Fan Xian, "Sir, this man really should be on good terms with you. It's a pity that you have to leave for home the day after tomorrow. This is your first time meeting him." Fan Xian put on a look of pity, but in his heart, he was wondering if Lang Tiao would recognize him. As he pondered this, Lang Tiao was also puzzled. The expression of the young official of the Kingdom of Qing was so natural, and did not seem to be fake at all. Could it be that Shen Zhong had guessed correctly? That the black-clothed man on the cliff was Chen Pingping's shadow guard, and not Commissioner Fan? Fan Xian's heart was calm. He swept his gaze over all the tables in the hall and asked, "Why don't I see Master Shen?" Lin Jing replied, "Although Shen Zhong is the provost of the Discipline Commission, his rank is not high enough to enter the imperial palace. Moreover, today is the Empress Dowager's birthday, so he must be in charge of all matters in Shangjing." Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything more. After a while, the ceremonial music in the palace gradually began. The sound of bamboo and string instruments played a magnificent feeling. There were dancers dancing in the hall, clear light appeared on the ceiling. The birthday banquet officially began. First, the Emperor raised his cup to the Empress Dowager and congratulated her on her birthday. Then, the officials below him knelt in order to wish her well. Fan Xian, as a foreign official, sat at the head of the table, and with Lin Jing at his side, secretly reminded him what to do. He passed this stage smoothly. Wine, fruits and vegetables were brought to the hands of beautiful palace maids, quietly and gracefully placed on each table. Every time a palace maid came to serve him, Fan Xian would always turn slightly and smile in acknowledgement. In the eyes of the Northern Qi officials, this was unavoidably a bit artificial, but there were also those who liked him more and more, feeling that this outstanding figure of the younger generation was indeed extraordinary. Fan Xian, on the other hand, looked at the soft eyebrows of the palace maids, and felt very uneasy. The young emperor spent every day with these beautiful girls, and yet he had not become a licentious youth. There was indeed something wrong with this. Although the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet was not an ordinary old lady's birthday, there was not much of a difference. It was just that the guests were of a higher class, and the wine and dishes were of a higher level. Naturally, the after-dinner entertainment was also a bit of a headache. This was definitely not the kind of entertainment that Aunt Li, west of Erdo village on Mount Teeling, would have thought of for her 50th birthday. Fan Xian rubbed his temples, a warm smile on his face, but in his heart, he had already begun to curse. Gentle girls now liked to call themselves old mothers to be forthright, boorish men now liked to smile shyly to be disgusting, pig butchers liked to eat their neighbors' vegetables, and old nannies with flowers on their heads, who could not get married, liked to go around being matchmakers. People all liked to get close to the things they were least good at, and liked to do the things they were least good at. According to psychology, if you lacked something, you would unconsciously emphasize it. So, under the leadership of the emperor, the kingdom of Qing, which had always been famous for its martial arts, began to walk the road of scholarly governance. Even though there were military generals and martial experts in the capital, poetry competitions were popular. In the palace, imperial concubine Shu was fond of literature, so she was favored. The second prince was well versed in the classics, and won the hearts of the people. Then, out of nowhere, the immortal poet Fan Xian appeared, immediately attracting the gazes and admiration of all scholars. Northern Qi, which had always been the center of literature, was now striving to become stronger. Poetry competitions were no longer popular, but rather preferred to play duels. Instead, they gave up on words and used fists to reason. As a result, the Qing diplomatic mission's entrance was littered with small scimitars. The number of Northern Qi experts who wanted to challenge Fan Xian could form a line from the diplomatic mission's entrance all the way to the valley of Mount Yen. Fan Xian shut himself in, and when he did, he traveled with Haitang. With great difficulty, he had avoided the tragic fate of fighting in the arena every day. Unexpectedly, before he was about to return home in this great hall, he could no longer avoid it. "Master Fan, what do you think of this proposal?" The Empress Dowager smiled, and turned her gaze to the table where Fan Xian sat. Although it was a question, her tone was unquestionable. Fan Xian shivered slightly. Earlier, one of the Northern Qi generals had proposed a duel. Although it was a nice way to talk about martial arts, everyone knew that the Northern Qi officials knew that there was nothing they could do about the so-called immortal poet in literature. They were prepared to humiliate him, and for some reason, the Empress Dowager seemed to dislike him. He stood up and swept his gaze across the hall. Suddenly, he smiled and said, "Empress Dowager, I do not have the strength to truss a chicken. Let's forget about it." There was a roar of laughter in the hall. No one believed Fan Xian's words. The news of Fan Xian killing Qing Jushu and beating Yi Ling with a black fist had long since spread throughout the world. He was publicly recognized as a rare man who excelled in both the pen and the sword. The officials had not expected the southern envoy to be so cowardly. The Empress Dowager said calmly, "You are too modest, Master Fan." She said a few more words, not allowing Fan Xian to refuse. Fan Xian's eyelid twitched. No wonder in the transmigration novels he had read in his previous life. All the transmigrators followed Lord Wei's glorious tradition and called the Empress Dowager an old whore. If he gave in now, he would lose face for the court. When he returned to the south, it would be difficult to explain to his father and the old cripple. He did not know what kind of sinister slander would be unleashed in Xinjiang. So he smiled and took half a step back, cupping his hands in acknowledgement. The Empress Dowager's eyes brightened, but the Emperor, who sat next to her, looked worried. He asked with concern, "Minister Fan, if you are not feeling well, let's forget about it." Although Fan Xian had only chatted with the Emperor a few times, and he had long held a grudge against him, he could hear the genuine concern in his words. He thought of the fact that the Emperor was, after all, the Emperor. He could not help but feel touched. He raised his head and said in a clear voice, "Your Majesty, even if my blood splatters in front of the hall, let it be a celebration of the Empress Dowager's birthday." These words were neither fish nor fowl, and greatly violated etiquette. They immediately spoiled the atmosphere, and the Empress Dowager's face darkened. The Emperor laughed, finding it very interesting. This Fan Xian was indeed gentle on the outside, but stubborn on the inside and unwilling to be taken advantage of. He waved his hand and said, "These words have gone too far. Since it is a competition, naturally it should be stopped when it is appropriate. The Emperor's eyes grew cold. He looked at the officials in the hall and said, "If anyone is unable to control the strength of their attack, then it is best that they do not come out and make a fool of themselves." These words first stopped those who were prepared to hurt him by accident. The officials felt a chill in their hearts. They realized that the speed at which this young emperor had matured over the years was astonishing. The emperor's power was growing stronger and stronger. Even stranger, why was His Majesty treating Fan Xian so well? Was this our emperor, or the emperor of the kingdom of Qing? As soon as the words were spoken, a general walked in from outside the side hall. He bowed to the Empress Dowager and the emperor. In a low voice, he said, "I, Tring Puju, wish to learn from Master Fan of the kingdom of Qing." The Empress Dowager nodded slightly. The emperor was aware of Tring Puju's level. He was Lang Tiao's martial nephew, and could be considered a student of the Tianyi faction. He was currently serving in the Imperial Guard, and had probably heard an order from his superiors, so he had come to compete. The emperor had learned from Haitang that Fan Xian was already at the beginning of the 9th level, while Tring Puju was only at the 7th level. Why? The emperor glanced at Lang Tiao, his martial master, and found that Lang Tiao was sitting calmly in his seat, his face expressionless. Tring Puju bowed to Fan Xian and said in a low voice, "Master Fan, you are a master of both the pen and the sword, and your name shakes the world. I ask for your guidance, Master Fan." Fan Xian smiled and also glanced at Lang Tiao. He knew that the competition in the palace today was not because he was competitive. Rather, it was because Lang Tiao wanted to see his fighting style before he returned home. After he had arrived in northern Qi, he had not fought in front of anyone. Lang Tiao must still have some doubts about the matter at the cliff. He cupped his hands towards Tring Puju. "Lord Tring." Tring Puju replied in a low voice, "Indeed." Fan Xian said, "You are not a match for me." He then sat down. The officials were in an uproar, thinking that Fan Xian was a bit too arrogant. Just as they were thinking this, they heard a steady voice. "I ask for your guidance, Lord Qing." Tring Puju was fuming, but then he saw the bodyguard behind Fan Xian take a step forward and stand in front of him. Sunlight shone down from the ceiling of the palace, scattering a clear light. The palace was incomparably bright, so he could clearly see the boundless murderous intent contained in the bodyguard's plain face. It was only one step. Gouda had only taken one step forward, but his entire person had changed. Before, he had been an unremarkable bodyguard, hidden in Fan Xian's shadow. Now that he had taken a step forward, he seemed to have the air of a grandmaster. There was no wind in the palace, but Gao Da's jinqi flowed through his body, causing his clothes to flutter slightly. Fan Xian used the cover of the table to sit on the floor, holding a small wine cup with 2 fingers. His eyes narrowed. He used his peripheral vision to observe Lang Tiao's expression. Lang Tiao seemed uninterested in what was happening. He held a pair of chopsticks in his hand, picking at the dishes on his plate. But Fan Xian's eyes were sharp, and he saw Lang Tiao's chin move slightly. This was a sign of agreement. Tring Puju took a deep breath. He looked at Gouda in front of him. Everyone in Shangjing knew that he was an expert bodyguard of the Southern Diplomatic Mission. He had once subdued General Tan Wu, a subordinate of General Shang Shan, in one move. He was a true master. But things had come to this, and Tring Puju could not back down. He shouted, "Your Majesty, please permit me to use my saber." Although the young emperor admired Fan Xian, he was no fool. He knew that he was the emperor of northern Qi, and he rather admired this general's courage and power. With a look of approval, he said, "Permitted. General Qing, do your best. This is purely a martial competition. Do not think of it as the face of the court. Whether you win or lose, I will reward you." The Empress Dowager looked at her son, her eyes full of disapproval. But the young emperor smiled, as if he did not see his mother's gaze. The two brothers, Lin Wen and Lin Jing, were extremely nervous. They were about to leave for home, so how could they cause such a ruckus in the palace? If they won, Northern Qi would lose face, and that would not be good. If they won, the Qing court would lose face, and that would be even worse. But the officials of the kingdom of Qing had developed a natural ruthlessness over the decades. Seeing the other side's provocation, even though they were civil officials, they were truly angry. They said to Gao De, "Guard Gao, don't go overboard. Talk of victory before the battle." Fan Xian glanced at the two deputies beside him and laughed bitterly. He thought to himself that these two were even more arrogant than him. Turning his head toward the emperor on the dragon chair, he said, "Your Majesty, please allow my subordinate to bring a knife into the palace." The emperor smiled at him and waved his hand. Outside the palace, it was known that there would be a martial competition. Today was the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet, so the palace had been lax. Furthermore, the emperor had given his approval, so the officials who had been eating in the side hall all rushed to the entrance of the palace, casting their eager gazes upon the field. A young eunuch fetched Gao Da's long saber from the palace's corner door and handed it to the eunuch in front of the palace. Fan Xian saw Wang Qinian standing at the entrance of the palace, sneakily looking in their direction. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. He wondered if Wang Qinian's hands were itching to return to his old profession and search for something in the palace. Gao De gripped the hilt of the long saber with both hands, and his entire mental state immediately entered a very strange state. The power from before was gone, and the oppressive feeling no longer existed. All that was left on the field seemed to be only one saber. Even though it was one man and one saber, in the eyes of a spectator, there was still only one saber. Lang Tao put down his chopsticks and looked at the unique long saber in Gao Da's hands. He seemed to have thought of something, and his brows furrowed slightly. Cheng Puzhu and Gao De stood facing each other. Looking at their opponent, who was standing steadily, they cast aside all distracting thoughts. Taking a deep breath, they slowly pulled out the curved saber from its sheath. The blade scraped against the mouth of the sheath, making a hot-blooded metallic sound. Gao De still did not move. Holding the long saber with both hands, his entire body leaned a few inches to the right. Cheng Puzhu slowly circulated his zhenqi, pouring it into his wrist. He felt as if his forearm had become one with the curved saber. Only then did he raise the blade slightly. He was Lang Tao's disciple nephew, and belonged to Ku He's faction. Although he was only a 7th-level martial artist, he had the self-confidence that his master had bestowed upon him. His opponent could be arrogant, but he would not. The saber flashed like snow. The distance of several feet between the two masters seemed to not exist. In a flash it disappeared. In the next moment, Cheng Puzhu had already appeared in front of Gao De. The two were very close, as if their faces were touching, and their bodies were touching. And that snow-like saber light came from Cheng Puzhu's hand. The curved saber was strangely hanging upside down. He raised it high, and the tip of the saber was aimed straight for Gao Da's left shoulder. The distance between the two was too close. Even Cheng Puzhu could only hang the curved saber upside down, using this treacherous and unpredictable method to stab. Furthermore, Gao De was holding the long saber with both hands. At this moment, there was no way he could unsheath it. Even if he did, there was no way he could use it at such a short distance. Cheng Puzhu lived up to his reputation as an extraordinary master. In a short time, he had relied on his opponent's weapon to come up with a plan to subdue him. The officials were slightly startled. It seemed that they were about to see blood spurt from Gao Da's shoulder. Fan Xian frowned slightly. It seemed that he had not expected Cheng Puzhu's attack to be as swift as lightning. Crack! An extremely unpleasant sound rang out. Immediately after, there was a shattering sound, followed by another muffled sound. In the next moment, the Empress Dowager, the Emperor, and the officials watching from outside, all watched in shock as a figure was sent flying. Qing Puju landed heavily on the ground. His face was covered in blood. It seemed that he had suffered a grievous injury. The crowd thought that Gouda had used Jinshi to send Qing Puju flying, and they couldn't help but be shocked. To send a 7th-level master flying with Jinshi, other than the 4 grandmasters, perhaps only a few 9th-level masters could do so. And Gouda was only a bodyguard of the Qing diplomatic mission. Only the martial masters present could clearly see what had happened. When Qing Puju's curved saber came down, Gouda did not draw it. Instead, he held the long saber with both hands and brought it down. The hilt of the long saber was about an inch wide, and it was this small area of the hilt that met the tip of Qing Puju's curved saber. The long saber in Gao Da's hands was as tall as a man. As he raised the saber, the scabbard stood firmly on the ground. So when the tip of the curved saber pierced the hilt, it was as if all of Qing Puju's Jinshi and power had been transferred through the long saber in Gao Da's hand to the bluestone floor beneath his feet. Gouda remained uninvolved. He watched as Qing Puju's attack, which he had been preparing for a long time, collided head-on with the ground. In the future, even if you were a grandmaster, so what? In that instant, Qing Puju felt an extremely powerful force pass through the tip of the saber, making it hard for him to breathe. And at that moment, Gouda put down his saber and cupped his fists. His arms seemed to form a circle, and he turned to the left. The steel-like tip of his right elbow struck Qing Puju's chin heavily. The blow was so powerful that it knocked out his opponent's teeth and split his lips. Blood flowed freely. Gouda had been merciful, otherwise this blow would have killed Qing Puju. Rather than saying that Qing Puju had been defeated by Gouda, it would be better to say that he had been defeated by the earth. A eunuch had already helped Qing Puju out of the room for treatment. Gouda calmly bowed to the emperor and the empress dowager, pulled out his long saber, and slowly retreated behind Fan Xian. With a crack, the bluestone floor where they had fought earlier began to crack inch by inch. Only now did the officials in the hall realize that the unsheathed long saber had been driven into the bluestone by Qing Puju's curved saber. What kind of power was this? Understanding that Gouda had used a trick, the officials began to talk among themselves, but they didn't say anything. Fan Xian looked at the expressions of the Northern Qi officials and smiled a little self-deprecatingly. In their eyes, this smile was a little repulsive. Fan Xian handed his cup of wine to Gouda behind him. Gouda was slightly taken aback. He took the cup and drained it in one gulp. "Thank you for the wine, sir. Thank you for your guidance." He didn't know what guidance Fan Xian had given him. Fan Xian smiled. It should be to thank the Empress Dowager for bestowing. Before he could finish, he realized that the hall had suddenly fallen silent, including the officials and eunuchs outside the hall. Because Lang Tiao had spoken. Lang Tiao smiled at Fan Xian. Sir Fan's little tricks truly live up to their reputation. I didn't expect even your bodyguard to understand them. Having said this, he stood up and gently took off his outer robe, handing it to a palace maid behind him, revealing the 2 curved sabers at his waist. The hall buzzed. Sir Lang Tiao was about to appear. Lang Tiao was the first disciple of the imperial advisor and the emperor's martial teacher. The officials in Beijing had not seen him in action for many years. Who would have thought that he would make an exception for the people of Qing today? The officials turned their burning gazes to Lang Tiao, but because of his special status, they didn't dare say anything. Before Lang Tiao had walked out, Fan Xian had already laughed and waved his hand. "I'm no match for you." Earlier, he had directly said that Qing Puju was no match for him. Now, he admitted that he was no match for him. In the ears of the Northern Qi people, he seemed somewhat open and aboveboard. Lang Tiao smiled. "Whether or not I'm a match, we'll only know after we fight." Fan Xian's heart trembled. He knew that if he really did fight with this ace, first, if he didn't use his hidden crossbow, poison needles, and aphrodisiac powder, then he wouldn't be able to last more than 3 rounds. Second, if Lang Tiao really did confirm that he was the man at the edge of the cliff, given Ku He's endless concealment of the temple, he would probably be hunted down. His brows furrowed tightly, but he knew that Lang Tiao had given the Qing people enough face by personally challenging them. He could not let Gao fight again. Just as his heart was gradually hardening and he was about to act, he heard a voice. "Senior brother, let me do it." Fan Xian was happy. Very happy. The people of Northern Qi were also happy, and those watching were even happier. Haitang slowly walked out from behind the Empress Dowager and bowed slightly to Lang Tiao. "Elder brother, let me do it." Seeing that it was her, Lang Tiao's expression softened. "That's fine, of course, but you have to be careful of Sir Fan's methods." Haitang bowed to the Empress Dowager and the Emperor, but didn't say anything. She walked in front of Fan Xian and smiled. "Are you coming?" "Of course, why wouldn't I?" The two of them didn't feel like they were talking to each other like children playing house. Of course, the people of Northern Qi, who had surrounded the Great Hall in 3 layers, didn't notice. Even the officials of the Qing diplomatic mission didn't notice. Everyone had sunk into some kind of anticipation. This kind of anticipation had already surpassed victory and defeat, and surpassed the prestige of the 2 countries. They simply wanted to see what would happen in a moment. One was the immortal poet of Qing, skilled in both the pen and the sword. He had become the commissioner of the Overwatch Council at the tender age of less than 20 Fan Xian. The other was the Northern Qi goddess, the youngest superior 9th-level ace after Ku He. She was a legendary Tianmai, and was believed to be the most likely to become the 5th great grandmaster, Haitang. Both of them were the most famous of the younger generation. It was rumored that the two of them had traveled around Shangjing, forgetting to return home. It seemed that they appreciated each other. This also proved that the two of them were indeed on the same level. The two of them were finally going to meet. After some time, Wang Qinian, who was standing guard at the door to the Great Hall, yawned. Looking at the young man and woman fighting in the hall, he muttered, "Who are they trying to fool?" A eunuch next to him said indignantly, "They're actually faking a fight in front of the Great Hall. Lady Haitang, how could you bear to disappoint us onlookers?" Wang Qinian said unhappily, "I didn't take your money, so naturally they weren't acting seriously. So what if it was a fake fight? Based on their status, I'm afraid even His Majesty the Emperor would be too embarrassed to expose them." Chapter 250. On the other side, Fan Xian's movements were clumsy. He held his palms horizontally and vertically, chopping back and forth like a kitchen knife. How could there be any nimbleness? Every time he struck out with his palm, there was a strong gust of wind that whistled and cut through the air. It looked overbearing, but each palm struck the air around Haitang. He had no intention of touching the girl's skin at all. He only lifted the corners of Haitang's coarse clothes. What technique was this? This was the technique Wu Bai always used when he went on stage to sing with an electric fan in front of him. This was the technique Stephen Chow threw newspaper pieces in front of the fan and unbuttoned the pajamas of the main characters. Haitang's clothes were like clouds. She smiled amidst the wind from the palms. On the long imperial platform, accompanied by water and light, she was as ethereal as a fairy. She floated as if she wanted to ride the clouds and fly away. Occasionally she would point to the east, then to the west. No one knew where she was pointing to. This was not a trick of pointing to the east or striking to the west. It was a young girl's way of commanding troops. The two of them fought like this for who knew how many rounds, but there was not the slightest hint of smoke or fire. Since they did not think of blood, their attacks were naturally light. It was like a vegetarian meal in a temple that did not even bear to use soybean oil. It was so light that it was nauseating. Even a young eunuch could see that the two masters were pretending to fight, not to mention the old foxes and young foxes in the hall. Some of the officials' eyes had long since widened. They had not expected Haitang and Fan Xian to be so thick-skinned as to not care about the face of the court at all. The Empress Dowager looked at the long platform in the hall and the two figures in the clear light. She could not help but snort coldly. Although she did not lose her composure, the fine lines at the corner of her eyes were full of hidden anger. Instead, it was the young emperor who watched Fan Xian float around in the clear light and could not help but laugh. Lang Tiao's face was calm as he watched the scene unfold. He knew that Fan Xian's seemingly clumsy attack was actually a very powerful coffin breaker. But that was a martial art passed down through the generations of the Yi family in the capital. How did this Fan kid learn it? Inside and outside the hall, the expectant crowd was finally disappointed. After watching for so long, some people could not help but yawn. The eunuch in front could not help but shake his head. Who knows how long this will last? In any case, there is no winner or loser. Wang Qinian also shook his head regretfully. I think someone is going to stop it soon. The young eunuch didn't believe it and shook his head. The officials in the hall are all shrewd people. Who would step forward? Wang Qinian started to argue with him. Finally, they got excited and started to bet on when the two people dancing on the long imperial platform would stop. Several people on the side saw that they were fighting excitedly, so they also came over and placed their own bet. 1 card of sea urchins, 2 cucumbers, and all kinds of strange bets were placed. Impudent! Finally, a minister looked at the Empress Dowager's increasingly gloomy face and couldn't bear it any longer. He slammed the table and stood up, angrily rebuking, "What are you doing at the Empress Dowager's birthday banquet? Are you trying to deceive me?" These words were not beautiful, just like a stupid child who cried out that the emperor was running around naked. No matter how ugly the world was, whoever cried out the truth first would be an extremely unlikable fellow. Just like today, even though he knew that Fan Xian and Haitang were playing the Chongling swordplay, he didn't cry out. The Empress Dowager could still thicken her face and watch. After all, it was her birthday today. Watching young children dance was not a big deal. But this minister's cry was deceiving the emperor. Wasn't that forcing the Empress Dowager to fly into a rage? So the Empress Dowager prepared to fly into a rage. She looked coldly at the minister, countless thoughts running through her mind. She wanted to tear his lips apart. The emperor was still smiling. In the pool, the two people on the imperial platform acted as if they hadn't heard the cheers of the audience. They acted seriously. Haitang floated back and forth. Fan Xian walked like a dragon or a tiger. The girl's figure was clear and beautiful, and little Fan Xian's appearance was handsome. It was really a good fight. In just a moment, they had fought from the imperial platform to the front of the palace behind it. They were only a few feet away from the dragon chair, and they stopped in front of the minister's table. Fan Xian's palm turned into a kitchen knife and chopped down viciously on the empty chopping board. He let out a cry as if he had missed. Haitang's posture in the air was slightly sluggish. 2 fingers of her right hand stabbed out like a sword. With a swish, she was about to strike Fan Xian's chest. No one knew how the two of them changed positions, but in the next moment, the wind from their palms and fingers did not strike anyone's body. Instead, with a swish, they surged forward. Behind them was the minister's seat. The minister was aghast. With Haitang and Fan Xian attacking at the same time, even if Imperial Advisor Ku He were here, he would still have to temporarily avoid the brunt of the attack. The short table was instantly shattered into countless pieces. The wine jug on the table cracked and the dishes fell. The smell of wine and oil filled the air, staining the minister's head and face. His brow was covered with cauliflower, his mouth was full of radish, and a few strands of golden mushrooms hung from his ears. The soup and water had washed his face. He was as miserable as one could imagine. The hall immediately quieted down. Only now did the ministers realize that Miss Haitang and the Southern Emperor's envoy were sometimes troublemakers. For the sake of their own reputation, it was best not to say anything more. Fan Xian and Haitang stopped fighting at the same time. Separated by a few steps, they looked at each other and smiled. Haitang bowed slightly to the Empress Dowager. "Master Fan, your coffin breaker technique is impressive. My daughter did not respond properly and thus affected you. I hope the Empress Dowager will forgive me. People can make mistakes." Fan Xian's face was also full of self-blame. He waved his right hand. "A horse can make a mistake." The Empress Dowager loved Haitang dearly and did not want to blame her. Besides, today was her birthday banquet, and making a scene to liven up the atmosphere was not bad. It was a pity that the Southern envoy had not suffered. But seeing Fan Xian's self-deprecating words, the Empress Dowager could not help but smile faintly. The Emperor also laughed strangely, and the ministers also laughed awkwardly. Only the true masters of the martial way knew that the seemingly joking fight actually contained some of the thoughts of the two young masters. The coffin breaker seemed crude, but it was actually stern. Haitang's finger sword seemed gentle, but it was actually fierce. The long dance on the imperial platform was also a kind of competition. But in the end, it seemed that Fan Xian had still lost. Now that the fake fight was over, the clear light from the roof still shrouded the secluded hall. Fan Xian and Haitang stood in the clear light. Their faces looked incomparably gentle in the light. The half-moon lantern that had fallen from the roof of the hall was reflected in the pool. This competition could be said to be a true laughing contest. The bright river and the moon shamed the palace. Night gradually enveloped the depths of the palace. The half-moon slowly climbed up from behind the green mountain behind the palace, spilling its warm and faint light into the northern Qi palace. The long black eaves and the gray and white palace walls reflected a beautiful figure at the beginning of the night. The ministers in front of the main hall were retreating out of the palace. Many guards could be seen around the palace, and there were also eunuchs waiting on the road. The speed at which the courtiers retreated was extremely fast. In a short while, the imperial palace regained its tranquility. There were no longer any miscellaneous people on the empty square. It only took the time it took to burn a stick of incense to turn from bustling to extremely quiet. After the banquet ended, the Empress Dowager rubbed her temples and returned to her bedroom. Fan Xian was left behind by the Emperor of Northern Qi, waiting in Huaying Palace. The palace was incomparably quiet. The faint scent of incense wafted into his nose. Fan Xian sat with his eyes closed. The Emperor of Northern Qi should be in the Empress Dowager's palace, fulfilling his filial duties. He didn't know why he was waiting here. The palace maids brought him tea and fruit. Fan Xian smiled and thanked them one by one. He found that the palace maids were all very charming, especially the slight shyness in their eyes, which made his heart flutter. But when he thought of the young emperor leaving him in the palace, and how the emperor seemed to have some problems in certain areas, Fan Xian's heart trembled. "His Majesty has something he needs your help with, Master Fan." The other girl, who was looking down, seemed to have guessed his fear and said calmly. The one who spoke was Haitang. Fan Xian was staying in the palace as a guest, so she had to be half a host. The girl thought of the scene in the hall earlier and felt a little dazed and amused. Why was it that when she was with Fan Xian, she always seemed more presumptuous than usual? Fan Xian smiled and didn't explain. A eunuch shouted something from outside the palace. A series of hurried footsteps approached Huaying Palace. Fan Xian thought, why the rush? What does this young emperor want me to do for him? He is the emperor of the 9 and 5. Apart from unifying the world, there is nothing he can't do. While Fan Xian was full of questions, the young emperor had already stepped into Huaying Palace. With a wave of his hand, he stopped Fan Xian and Haitang from paying their respects. With his right hand, he took off his outer robe and threw it to a young eunuch who followed behind him. Only the thin yellow robe was left, and he looked very spirited. Then, the emperor sat down on the couch. With a push of his feet, a eunuch carefully took off his boots, revealing his feet, which were only wrapped in thin socks. Perhaps Haitang was used to seeing the emperor in private, so she wasn't surprised. Fan Xian was a bit surprised that the Northern Qi emperor had revealed such a private side in front of him. He didn't hide his surprise. Turning his gaze toward the soft couch, he even, intentionally or unintentionally, tapped the emperor's chest and feet a few times. Not big, not small. Not big, not small. Chapter 251. Mother likes peace and quiet. The young emperor leaned back on the couch and took a sip of the swallow's nest that a eunuch had brought him. He frowned and waved his hand for all the palace maids and eunuchs to leave. The palace hall immediately quieted down. Fan Xian bowed slightly. "What are your orders, your majesty?" Seeing how cautious the southern envoy was, the emperor of Northern Qi smiled. "Minister Fan," he said, "you will be leaving for home the day after tomorrow. Make sure you take good care of the first princess." Fan Xian was startled. Only now did he realize that he had not been paying attention to this important matter. Welcoming the first princess back home to be married was an important matter. There could be no mistakes on the journey. These days, he had long learned from Yen Bingyun that this great princess of Northern Qi had been raised deep in the palace. She was the half-brother of the emperor in front of him. Her birth mother had long died in some cold palace. The great princess had never been liked by the Empress Dowager, which was why she was willing to let her become a sacrifice in a political marriage. He didn't know why the emperor had suddenly mentioned the first princess. Logically speaking, the emperor should not have had much of a relationship with that sister. But seeing the faint worry on the emperor's face, Fan Xian knew that he had guessed wrong. As expected, the emperor sighed. The first princess has never left the palace. Now that she is married off to the south, even though I am the son of heaven, I cannot protect her. Fan Xian said sincerely, "Do not worry, your majesty. The great prince is a hero of our kingdom, and is most respected by the people. The great princess and the great prince will certainly live in harmony in the future, and they will grow old together. All the officials in the court will treat the princess with respect, and will not dare to slight her." The emperor laughed coldly. "What use is that?" He suddenly stared into Fan Xian's eyes. "Minister Fan, I see you as a friend. I hope that while you are in Nanjing, you will give the first princess some advice. You must ensure that she lives a happy life." Fan Xian was shocked again. He had only met the emperor 4 times. How could he dare be a friend of the Son of Heaven? Seeming to guess what he was thinking, the emperor smiled and said, "Minister Fan, when we first met, I said that I liked your poems and often recited them. Those words were as if you were speaking. Since I have spoken to you for a year, it is not surprising that I regard you as my friend." At this moment, Fan Xian was truly overwhelmed by the favor and ashamed. Just as he was about to kowtow to thank the emperor and cry out in fear, he heard the Northern Qi emperor's light voice ring out. There was a glimmer of anger in the voice. "But Minister Fan seems to be distancing himself from me. Not to mention the fact that he refuses to come into the palace to talk to me." The Northern Qi emperor suddenly looked into his eyes. "Even if there are many things you still hide from me." Fan Xian was worried. He explained, "There are many matters to attend to. I am busy with both Honglu Temple and Taichung Temple. I dare not leave the palace and disturb your majesty's rest." The Northern Qi emperor glanced at the silent Haitang and suddenly smiled. "Is that so? I thought that these days, the most you have done is accompany my aunt disciple to go shopping and drink." Hearing this, even Haitang could not continue to sit still. With a trace of unease, she replied, Duo often asks Sir Fan for guidance on the way of the heavens, and has benefited greatly." His Majesty shook his head and looked at Fan Xian. "Then how long do you intend to keep that matter hidden, Minister Fan?" A drop of cold sweat emerged from Fan Xian's hair, but it refused to slide off his forehead or reveal the fear in his heart. It only remained in his long, black hair. Fan Xian's first thought was, had Sea Lily's matter been exposed? If that was the case, then even if the emperor in front of him did not like women, the Son of Heaven's desire to monopolize power would not allow him to leave Northern Qi alive. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that Haitong's calm face was calm, without a trace of fear or unease. He felt a little more at ease. He coughed twice and respectfully asked, "What matter does your Majesty speak of?" No one knew about Shaowen's matter, except for Haitong, who might have guessed a little. As long as it was not about Sea Lily, Fan Xian would not feel the slightest bit of guilt or fear when facing the Northern Qi Emperor. Unexpectedly, the Northern Qi Emperor's next question almost made Fan Xian fall off his chair. Tonight's conversation in the palace was one of shock after another. "I have come to ask you, how is your sister Lin?" The Northern Qi Emperor looked at Fan Xian coldly. It was like a bolt of lightning had struck deep into the palace, like a girl crying out in the middle of a thunderstorm. Fan Xian was dumbstruck, his body stiff. For a moment, he did not know how to answer. How could this emperor know that Wan was his cousin? That was to say, he knew his true identity. That was impossible. That was impossible. There were no more than 5 people in the world who knew of his true identity, and those 5 people could not have leaked this shocking secret. But the problem was, the Northern Qi Emperor was the Son of Heaven, and had countless capable subordinates. Could it be that he had discovered this matter from some traces and yellow papers? Otherwise, why would he suddenly ask about his own wife, his sister Lin? The Northern Qi Emperor looked at him coldly. Seeing his panicked expression, he suddenly slapped the armrest of the soft couch and scolded, "Speak! Speak, my ass!" Fan Xian's expression was mostly faked, but he still maintained a strong calm inside. His left pinky slightly crooked, but he suddenly remembered that because he was afraid that Haitong would find out about his connection to the incident at the cliff, he had not brought the black dagger on his left leg these days. Fight? He could not beat Haitong. Escape? If Northern Qi revealed his identity, wouldn't the Crown Prince, the Great Prince, and the Second Prince immediately become a pack of hungry tigers? And those women deep in the palace? Fan Xian coughed, and a smile reappeared on his face. Since the Emperor had said it in front of him, naturally, he was prepared to threaten him. So he prepared to play dumb and listen to the Emperor's conditions first. "Your Majesty, what are you talking about?" The Northern Qi Emperor stood up. Stepping on the soft boots, he couldn't be bothered to put them back on. Just like this, he walked directly toward Fan Xian. The expression on his face gradually brightened. From the slight anger earlier, it turned into a faint smile. In that smile, there was a hidden sense of excitement and anticipation. Seeing this expression, Fan Xian was startled. He was even more certain that this little brother of the Emperor was a little pervert. A pair of hands grasped Fan Xian's shoulders, and the Northern Qi Emperor somewhat lost his composure as he shook Fan Xian's shoulders. His eyebrows danced and he laughed brightly. "Minister Fan, oh Minister Fan, you have kept me in the dark. You have kept everyone in the world in the dark." Fan Xian had long since given up on the idea of forcing the Northern Qi Emperor to flee to the ends of the world. He looked somewhat stupidly at the face that was so close to him, and found that the Emperor was quite good-looking. The Emperor bathed every day, and his breath was quite fresh. Haitong looked at the Emperor's fervent expression, and at Fan Xian's stupidity, and could not help but laugh. "Grand Master Chao." The Northern Qi Emperor shook him again, making Fan Xian dizzy. "Grand Master Chao. Quick, tell me, did Sister Lin end up with Baoyu?" He finally understood what was going on. Although he did not know how the Northern Qi Emperor had guessed this, Fan Xian could no longer bear the torment of surprise and joy. He sat down on a chair, and without saying anything else, he picked up the teacup beside him and took 2 gulps. The Emperor looked at him with a smile. If you do not finish telling me the story of the stone, I will not allow you to leave the palace. Fan Xian sighed. How did your Majesty know that the story of the stone was written by me? The Emperor looked at Haitang, and Haitang smiled. Books are only published by Danbo Bookstore. Mr. Chow has always been a recluse, and other than Danbo Bookstore, no one else knows who he is. The story of the stone is very popular, and who knows how many people have tried to guess who he really is. The day before yesterday, when we were drinking, Sir Fan seemed to have talked a little too much, and naturally, I guessed a little. Today, your Majesty has tried to trick me again, and since Sir Fan has admitted it, I guess I guessed correctly. Fan Xian smiled bitterly, not knowing what to say. In truth, he did not really need the reputation of being the author of the story of the stone. Seeing how the Northern Qi Emperor had called him Grand Master Chow so intimately, he had almost mistaken him for Guojia. Presumably, he was also a fan of the story of the stone. Having confirmed that Fan Xian was the author of the story of the stone, the Northern Qi Emperor seemed very happy. Quickly, tell me, he said, how many girls did Bao Yu marry in the end? Fan Xian laughed in spite of himself, thinking that this emperor was a fan of harem novels. He waved his hands and pleaded. Your Majesty, I have only randomly written some 60 chapters. I have not thought of the rest. As he said this, he thought of Roro in Danzhou, when she had asked him to write. He had thought of the problems of writing, updating, and leaving it unfinished. It was a very troublesome matter. Hearing this, the Northern Qi Emperor sighed and frowned. He glanced at Haitang, who was resting to the side. Suddenly, he moved closer to Fan Xian's ear and said in a low voice, "The Haitang Poetry Society in Chapter 37, what does it have to do with Ant Master?" Out of the corner of his eye, Fan Xian saw that the corners of Haitang's eyes had softened slightly. He knew that she was eavesdropping, and so he smiled and replied boldly, "Your Majesty, the author cannot explain himself. Forgive me for not saying more." The Emperor revealed a hint of warmth and said, "Then return quickly, Minister Fan. Once you have a chapter, remember to send it to me." Fan Xian accepted the order fearfully, not daring to say more. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "I am different from most people in this world." After leaving the palace, Haitang was surprised to find that the Grand Tutor was still standing guard outside the palace. Fan Xian's expression did not change when he saw His Majesty's teacher. Presumably, he had already known about it. Haitang bowed to the Grand Tutor and then turned to Fan Xian. "I will see you off the day after tomorrow." Fan Xian understood the hidden meaning in her words. He nodded and got into the Grand Tutor's carriage. Watching the 3 carriages gradually disappear into the night of Shangjing, Haitang's bright eyes suddenly became unfocused. She thought about the last words of that handsome young official from the south. Different? In the eyes of the world, Fan Xian was naturally different. But she did not know how he thought he was different. The carriages stopped outside a quiet courtyard. The imperial soldiers responsible for the diplomatic mission's safety finally learned that the great scholar of southern Qi, Fan Xian, had made his last visit in northern Qi. He had come to see this master. Thinking of the poem duel that had been rumored all over the world, they could not help but feel uneasy. They did not know what Fan Xian was thinking, but in this courtyard filled with books, they naturally quieted down. The tiger guards in the first carriage got out. Their eyes were fierce, and they guarded a few key points. Fan Xian and the Grand Tutor of Northern Qi walked down from the carriage hand in hand. Although their attitude was not necessarily friendly, it did not seem to be hostile either. Everyone felt a little more at ease. They saw the Grand Tutor, who had always been upright and outspoken, quietly say something to Fan Xian, and the 2 of them pushed open the door and entered. Fan Xian waved his hand, indicating that the tiger guards should not follow. Outside a room in the courtyard, the Grand Tutor bowed deeply to the inside of the room. He turned back to Fan Xian and said calmly, "Master Fan, my teacher has not been well recently. Please do not talk for too long." Fan Xian politely bowed to the great scholar, tidied his clothes, and gently pushed open the wooden door. Looking out, he saw an old man holding a small brush and scribbling something on a piece of paper. This old man was a master of scripture, and his students were spread all over the world. The Grand Tutor of Northern Qi and Shu the scholar of Southern Qi were both his disciples. Before Fan Xian revealed his brilliance, no one could compare to him in scholarly matters. Even after Fan Xian shamelessly defeated Guo Jingming in the palace hall in an attempt to win by a fluke, no one truly believed that other than poetry, Fan Xian had reached the level of Guo Jingming in other areas. This was because the old man's surname was Zhuang, and his name was Mohan. There were no servants in the room, nor was there a page boy. Only the old man, wearing a loose robe, continued to copy. Occasionally, he would frown and stare at the paper, flipping through the pages beside him, as if looking for some sort of confirmation. Compared to last year in the kingdom of Qing, Zhuang Mohan's spirit seemed to be much worse. Although his silver hair was still tightly bound, the age spots on his cheeks had become more pronounced, revealing some sort of inauspicious sign. Fan Xian did not want to disturb him, so he quietly walked behind him and cast his gaze on the table. He was surprised to find that on the table was the Banxianzhai poetry collection from Danbo bookstore, and on the margins of the poetry collection, who knew how many notes had been written? Could it be that this master of literature was writing notes for the poetry collection he had memorized? Zhuang Mohan's withered finger pointed at the second half of the line in the collection. "Those who have seen the ocean cannot be water, those who have not seen Mount Wu are not clouds." He kept tapping the page, his lips slightly parted, and with some pain, he said, "It doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. There is only the beauty of words. The second half of the line doesn't make sense, it really doesn't make sense. Tell me, what does it mean?" After a moment of silence, Fan Xian's gentle voice rang out, "Mount Wu is a sacred mountain in the extreme south. It is surrounded by clouds all year round, clouds at dawn and rain at dusk. Anyone who has seen this scenery and this cloud will not be bothered to look at any other white fog in the world." These two words are the second half of the line, purely speaking of emotional loyalty. "So that's how it is." Zhuang Mohan smiled bitterly and pointed at a thick book in the corner of the large table. "Of course I could guess what it meant, but I couldn't find it. Flipping through this book, I couldn't find the cloudy Mount Wu. So it is a sacred mountain in the extreme south. No wonder I didn't know about it." Fan Xian saw that Zhuang Mohan did not suspect that he was making things up, and knew that this old man was a very gentle and tolerant person. So he smiled and stepped forward to grind the ink. He watched as Zhuang Mohan copied his explanation into the blank spaces of the book in small, meticulous characters. Zhuang Mohan's regular script was famous throughout the world, and its purity was second to none. But looking at it today, Fan Xian could not help but sigh. The old man's hands were trembling a little. The Prince of Qin used to hold banquets and drink wine without restraint. What's the story behind this? Zhuang Mohan did not look at him and continued to ask. Fan Xian felt awkward. When he was publishing the poetry anthology, he had specifically deleted Li Bai's bringing in the wine. Why was this old man asking him? Zhuang Mohan sighed. "Ever since I was a child, I have a photographic memory. I can't help but be proud of myself. That day you recited poetry like a river, and I couldn't help but feel a little hurt." The old man laughed at himself. "But it was thanks to this ability that I could remember so many of your poems. Later, when the Banxianzhai poetry anthology was published, I found that many of them were missing. I don't know what you were thinking, child. Hearing Zhuang Mohan call him child, Fan Xian felt a strange feeling in his heart. He coughed twice and explained, the Prince of Qin was a prince with the surname Chao. He once held a banquet in Pingguang. A prince with the surname Chao? Zhuang Mohan raised his head. His cloudy eyes carried a trace of self-confidence. But, for 1,000 years there has never been a royal family with the surname Chao. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and tried to persuade him. I'm just spouting nonsense. You don't have to worry about it. That won't do. Zhuang Mohan was stubborn in certain areas. He flipped through all the poems he had written by hand and pointed to one of them. In the middle is Little Xie Yu Kingfa. Who is this Little Xie? Fan Xian's face alternated between green and white. After a while, he replied, Little Xie was a scholar who wrote stories. Although his writings were crude and could not be passed down, he had some fame in the marketplace. Then, after some time, when Fan Xian felt that he had run out of things to say and had lost interest in life, Zhuang Mohan finally sighed. He rubbed the corner of his eyes and threw his brush into the inkstone. He said with some sadness, I've run out of oil. I can't compare to when I was a scholar. After entering the room, the two of them did not greet each other. They threw themselves into this somewhat absurd task until now. Fan Xian rolled up his sleeves and bowed politely. Greetings, Master Zhuang. I don't know why you've summoned me here. The room became quiet. After a long time, Zhuang Mohan suddenly trembled, and with great difficulty, he bowed deeply to Fan Xian. Fan Xian was so shocked that he forgot to help him up. What kind of person was this old man? He was the Grand Master of the Emperor of Northern Qi. Why would he come to pay his respects? Zhuang Mohan had already straightened up. His wrinkled face was full of smiles. It's been a year since we met last year in the kingdom of Qing. I've always been virtuous. Last year, I framed Master Fan in the kingdom of Qing, and I've felt uneasy ever since. I've asked you to come here today to make amends. Fan Xian was silent. Of course, he knew that Zhuang Mohan had accepted the eldest princess's request. He had given up decades of face and traveled thousands of miles to the south to be a villain. It was all for the sake of Shaoan's release. This was brotherly love, what Fan Xian lacked the most. Shaoan is dead. Fan Xian looked at the old man in front of him, who had suddenly become much thinner in the past year. His thin lips parted slightly, and these 4 words came out. Zhuang Mohan looked at him with a smile, but said nothing. Fan Xian also smiled, knowing that he was being unnecessary. After all, Zhuang Mohan was an old Taoist who had been in the world for decades. He had deep roots in the kingdom of Northern Qi. How could he not know of this major event? Everyone has to die. Zhuang Mohan's words seemed to be for himself to hear, but also seemed to be for Fan Xian to hear. So if you live, you must live well. The way my brother has lived is meaningless. He killed countless people, and in the end he ended up like this. Fan Xian didn't quite agree with this saying. In this world, murder and arson are golden belt. Repairing bridges and paving roads leaves no corpses. Zhuang Mohan shook his head. Don't be that kind of person. It wasn't that he couldn't, but that he didn't want to. If any outsider were to stand in this room and hear the conversation between Zhuang Mohan and Fan Xian, and see their natural and unpretentious expressions, they would feel a little strange. The difference in life experience between these two people was too great, and the only time they had met was because of a conspiracy. Yet these two people could use the most direct words to express their attitude. Perhaps this was the so-called power of book. Why not? There was a chill between Fan Xian's brows. I'm very confident. Zhuang Mohan suddenly laughed, but there was a deep sadness hidden in his smile. I'm confident that I'm much happier than my brother. Fan Xian stared into his eyes. But you should know that if it weren't for Shaoan, perhaps you would never have obtained the position you have today. Zhuang Mohan stared back at him. But you still don't know. When death gradually approaches, you will realize that power, status, and wealth are all just fleeting clouds. Fan Xian replied calmly and stubbornly, "No, when death comes, perhaps you will regret this life. You haven't experienced anything, you haven't enjoyed anything. You only already have something in this life that normal people will never be able to have. That is why when Hua Lao passed away you had some thoughts." Zhuang Mohan shook his head helplessly. "You are still young. You have never smelled the deepening smell of death around you day after day. How would you know what you will think when the time comes?" "I know," Fan Xian repeated somewhat mechanically. "Believe me, I know that feeling." Zhuang Mohan seemed to be a little tired, and he didn't want to continue this topic. He changed the subject. "I didn't think that the person who could write such a rebellious text as Story of the Stone would still be my own filthy work." Fan Xian laughed bitterly. "I also didn't think that such a thing as a rumor could fly faster than a bird." Zhuang Mohan's eyes suddenly revealed a trace of concern. "Master Fan, when you return home, you must be careful. Story of the Stone has many taboos." Fan Xian was silent. He also knew this, but in his youth, he had been frivolous. He couldn't bear to lose the opportunity for those words to appear in this world, so he had casually written them. Now that he was in officialdom, he naturally understood that if someone wanted to find innuendo in them, it would be all too easy. Furthermore, there was a coincidence in this matter that shocked even Fan Xian, so he had no choice but to be cautious. It was a pity that the Emperor of Northern Qi was also a fan of romance, so this matter couldn't be hidden any longer. But Zhuang Mohan shouldn't be so concerned about him. This was what Fan Xian was puzzled about. Zhuang Mohan seemed to guess what he was thinking. He smiled. "Master Fan, I invited you here today not only to apologize for my selfishness, but also to thank you." "Thank you?" Fan Xian frowned. He didn't think that Zhuang Mohan knew that he had extended Shaoen's life by a day. "I thank you on behalf of all the scholars in the world." Zhuang Mohan looked at him with a smile. "Master Fan, when you first entered the Overwatch Council, you exposed the fraud of the Kingdom of Qing's imperial examinations. This matter affected the world, and even His Majesty wanted to reform the imperial examinations. Master's actions will benefit many poor scholars. Perhaps you do not think much of me, but on behalf of all the scholars of the world, I must thank you." Fan Xian's lips curled up in a self-deprecating smile. "Exposing fraud? That's the business of scholars. Is there a need for thanks?" But Zhuang Mohan did not smile. His turbid eyes were a little lifeless. He had not done much to bring Shao En back to the country this time. The most important thing was that he did not want this matter to cause the entire court to descend into chaos. But he knew that this world was not made up entirely of scholars. There were politicians, schemers, and martial artists. Their methods of handling matters were sometimes more direct and wilder. He looked at Fan Xian. He was about to say something, but then he remembered that this was, after all, Northern Qi's internal affairs. There was no need to say anything to him. After a long time, Fan Xian left the courtyard where Zhuang Mohan lived. He never returned for the rest of his life. Summer arrived. Although the hottest days of the year should have long since passed, Northern Qi was located in the northeast of the continent. Autumn was particularly hot and humid, and the drizzling rain that was common in late spring and early summer had long since disappeared. Only the bright, white sun hung overhead, frivolously and fiercely forcing people to take off their clothes until they couldn't. Outside the southern gate of Shangjing, a bright yellow carriage disappeared through the gate, and the old, greenish-gray city wall immediately became the most conspicuous thing in the eyes of the people outside the city. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes as he looked in that direction. He felt uneasy. The Emperor had personally come to see off the Qing diplomatic mission. This was completely against the rules. No matter how the Northern Qi officials tried to dissuade him, they couldn't stop him. So they had no choice but to send a large number of high-ranking officials and powerful officials. Even the Grand Tutor had come out of the city to see them off, giving the Qing diplomatic mission enough face. Earlier, the Emperor and Fan Xian had been holding hands and chatting about everyday things, constantly thinking about the story of the stone and the like. Who knew how many gazes they had attracted? With great difficulty, they had finally managed to get this somewhat eccentric emperor to leave. Outside the city were only the officials of Northern Qi and the ceremonial guards. Fan Xian glanced around and saw Wei Hua, but he did not see Chang Ningho or Shen Zhong. He felt his back was drenched. He didn't know if it was because of the emperor's fright or the sun. The auspicious hour had not yet arrived, so the diplomatic mission could not leave. He looked at the most magnificent carriage in front of the group. The great princess of Northern Qi was in it. He had only glanced at her from a distance. He could vaguely see that she was a beautiful noble, but he didn't know what her personality was like. But Fan Xian wasn't worried about the return trip. After the incident with Haitang, Fan Xian was more confident in his ability to get along with women. A cool breeze swept past, and Fan Xian immediately relaxed. He tugged at the buttons on his clothes, thinking, how could there be such a gentle breeze in this terrible weather? He turned his head and, as expected, Wang Qinian was next to him, waving his fan in a fawning manner. His face was full of sadness and reluctance. Fan Xian couldn't help but burst out laughing. It's only been a year. Why are you so sad? I'll take care of your wife and children. Don't worry. With the diplomatic mission leaving, Yan Bingyun naturally had to follow them back home. As a result, the Overwatch Council of Qing's spy network in Northern Qi was suddenly without a leader. So the Overwatch Council decided to have Wang Qinian stay in Shangjing as the minister of the Grand Herald Temple of Qing's permanent residence in Northern Qi. He would temporarily take charge of matters in the north, and in half a year, the council would secretly send officials to take over. As commissioner, Fan Xian's status in the council was special. Matters like this did not need to go through the formalities of the yamen in the capital, so it was easily settled. But Wang Qinian hadn't expected that he would not be returning with the diplomatic mission. He couldn't help but feel uneasy and disappointed. Although he knew that this experience would greatly benefit his future promotion, he still felt a little uneasy. Sir, if I don't listen to you for a day, I feel uneasy all over. Wang Qinian looked at Fan Xian reluctantly. Fan Xian smiled. Don't get into conflict with Northern Qi. Be wise and play it safe. In a year's time, I'll welcome you in the capital. In truth, he was used to having such a sidekick at his side. Most importantly, Wang Qinian was his only trusted aide in the council. Unfortunately, because he had to prepare to deal with the eldest princess's money channel, he had no choice but to stay in Northern Qi. While they were talking, a horse suddenly came out of the city gate. The person on the horse was not an official, but was dressed like a servant. He couldn't help but attract the attention of the officials. They thought to themselves, why would the yamen of the 9 cities of Shangjing let a commoner come here? Fan Xian's eyes were sharp, and he saw that the face of the Grand Tutor, who stood at the head of the group, darkened, and his eyes showed sorrow. The horse rode directly to the front of the group, and the servant on the horse fell off. With a sobbing voice, he moved closer to the Grand Tutor and said something. He handed the Grand Tutor a roll of cloth, and then pointed to the city gate behind them. The Grand Tutor's body swayed. He didn't know what had happened, but he looked at the carriage slowly approaching from the city gate and shook his head sorrowfully. He turned his head to glance at Fan Xian, but his eyes were filled with surprise. He took a deep breath and then walked toward Fan Xian. Fan Xian didn't know what had happened. He nervously dismounted and went to greet him. He accepted the roll of cloth the Grand Tutor handed him and nervously opened it. He saw that it was a collection of poems. On the pages were a few words written in slightly meandering old handwriting. Banxian's High Poetry Collection, Notes by Lao Zhuang. The Grand Tutor looked at the silent Fan Xian with mixed feelings and said, "This was given to you by Sir." Speaking to this point, his tone couldn't help but carry a deep sorrow and heaviness. Sir Zhuang has gone. Chapter 253. Fan Xian held the scroll in his hand, not knowing what to say for a moment. He had not expected his meeting with Zhuang Mohan the night before to be his last. That night, he had discovered that Zhuang Mohan was not as energetic as he had been the previous year, but he had not expected the leader of the literary world to so abruptly bid farewell to the world. Zhuang Mohan's last words were to hand over this book, the result of his last work, to Fan Xian. The meaning hidden within was not simple. At this time, the officials who were seeing Fan Xian off outside Shangjing gradually learned of this shocking news. A sense of grief began to fill the air, and more northern Qi officials turned their gazes to Fan Xian. Their gazes were vigilant, resentful, and suspicious. Fan Xian understood what the northern Qi people were thinking. Zhuang Mohan's only stain in his life was his own. But now that he was gone, Fan Xian felt a little sad, and he subconsciously filtered out all the complicated gazes. As he was thinking, the carriage at the city gate finally arrived. Under the gazes of the officials, it came to the back of the diplomatic mission's convoy. The wood of the carriage was slightly deformed, and it creaked noisily. One could imagine that the carriage must have been carrying something very heavy. The servant who had come to deliver the news led Fan Xian to the carriage. In a trembling voice, he said, "Master Fan, the old master has ordered that you take this carriage back to the south and preserve it well." The crowd had not yet recovered from the shock of Zhuang Mohan's death. Seeing this scene, they could not help but feel sad. They could not help but be curious as to what Zhuang Mohan had wanted to give Fan Xian before he died. The sun was glaring. Fan Xian squinted and lifted the thick curtain of the carriage, but he could not help but be dazzled by the contents inside. Inside the books were beauties, inside the books were houses of gold, and inside the books were grains of millet. Although there were no beauties or jewels in the carriage, Fan Xian was still surprised and moved. It was an entire carriage full of books, presumably Zhuang Mohan's life's collection. Given the old man's status, he did not need to flip through the books to guess that they were rare and unique. The servant respectfully handed over a booklet and said, "Master Fan, this is the list of books compiled by the master himself. Behind it are the precautions for preserving books." Fan Xian sighed and put down the curtain. He picked up the book and read it carefully. Although printing had made great progress, printing books was still a very impressive thing, not to mention an entire carriage. Thinking of the old man's act of gifting a book to him, he couldn't help but feel touched. At this moment, he heard the servant say sorrowfully, "Master gifted a book to you, please take good care of it." Fan Xian knew that this family member had said this on his own initiative, but he still raised his hands and bowed sincerely. Solemnly, he said, "Brother, please do not worry. Even if I die, these books will continue to be passed down in this world." By now, the northern Qi officials had gathered around. They could clearly see that the carriage was piled with books. These officials had all come from the imperial examinations, so how could they not know the value of this carriage full of books? None of them had expected that Master Zhuang, on his deathbed, would give these precious books, which he had spent his entire life studying, to the officials of the southern court. They could not help but feel shocked and a little jealous. The Grand Tutor, however, understood his master's intentions and could not help but sigh. Gifting the books was only an act. Zhuang Mohan used this action to show his attitude. This was not just a simple gift, but a symbolic inheritance. No matter how proud the civil officials of northern Qi were, from now on, they could no longer ignore Fan Xian's existence. and Fan Xian's position in the hearts of the world's scholars had finally been acknowledged in a certain ceremony. Fan Xian turned his head to look at the Grand Tutor and said sincerely, "It is only right that I return to the city to pay my respects. Only then will I be at ease." The Grand Tutor could not hide the sorrow in his eyes. Right now, all he wanted was to return to the city to pay his respects, and he did not have time to think about it. In addition, Fan Xian had taken the initiative to offer his respects, which comforted him, so he agreed. Unexpectedly, Wei Hua, the vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald, approached the two of them. He bowed and said in a deep voice, "The world mourns Master's passing. But Master Fan, the diplomatic mission schedule has been set, and the ceremonial guards have been raised. We cannot return to the city." After a moment of silence, Fan Xian raised his eyes to look at the greenish-gray walls of Shangjing. It was as if he could see a faint purple light floating in the sky above. He tidied up his clothes and bowed deeply in the direction of the city. He bowed all the way to the ground, performing the etiquette of an outer sect disciple. The Grand Tutor was slightly surprised. He knew that Fan Xian's disciples' bow was enough to put an end to last year's storm, and that his act of respect had cemented Master Zhuang's monument. He felt a little comforted and returned the bow. The cannon sounded, but it was unclear whether it was a send-off or a call for the soul. Shredded paper flew everywhere, and the slightly pungent smell of smoke dissipated in a flash, like the impermanence of this world. The diplomatic mission's carriages moved slowly, following the road to the west. Behind the carriages, the officials of Northern Qi watched as the southern carriages left, and as the heavy carriage carrying books followed them. They could not help but sigh in unison. Straightening their clothes, they went back to their manners to change, and hurried to Master Zhuang's manor. Presumably, the Empress Dowager and His Majesty had already arrived, and no one dared to tarry. The Grand Tutor and the scholars, who had been personally taught by Zhuang Mohan, were crying so hard they almost fainted. The group of carriages continued forward. When the majestic city walls of Shangjing gradually disappeared into the green mountains and dense forests, they arrived at the first relay station outside of Shangjing. According to the rules, a large group of people from the diplomatic corps returning home and the bridal party had to settle here for the night before continuing on their journey the next day. Fan Xian slowly dismounted from his horse and walked forward. As he passed by the carriage carrying books, he could not help but turn his head to look at it, but he resisted the urge to get on. He walked up to the luxurious carriage, painted gold and painted red, and bowed. "We have arrived at the courier station," he said respectfully. "Princess, please take a rest." After some time, a faint voice came from within the carriage. "Sir, please help yourself. I would like to sit alone for a while." This was the first time Fan Xian had heard the great princess's voice. It sounded slightly hoarse, and he could not help but feel a little strange. Then he saw the curtain of the carriage lift, and a palace maid stepped out, her eyes red. She walked to his side and said quietly, "Her Highness is not feeling well. Sir Fan, please wait a moment." Fan Xian asked with concern. "Her Highness is of noble birth, and naturally cannot endure such a long journey. It is only right for her to rest." The palace maid looked at Fan Xian's handsome face, and for some reason, she felt an inexplicable sense of trust in him. She said quietly, "The princess was once taught by Master Zhuang. Today she has received this news, so she is a little sad." Fan Xian finally understood, and his gaze toward the carriage carried a trace of sympathy. It seemed that the princess was not an arrogant and willful person, and that she would not stop crying out of gratitude for her teacher's kindness. But Zhuang Mohan had passed away in the city, and the princess was in the carriage, and could not pay her respects. It was truly a sad thing to be in the royal family. He sighed. Perhaps he was thinking of his own past. He gave the palace maid a few instructions, then summoned the Tiger Guards and the corps members of the diplomatic mission, and made arrangements. Only then did he enter the courier station alone. The courier station knew that the wedding procession and the diplomatic mission would be passing through, and so it had long since been cleaned up. All kinds of equipment were handled according to the rules of the palace. After a brief inspection, Fan Xian passed through the main room and quietly exited through the back door. His figure disappeared behind the tall beams behind the courier station. After a while, most of the people had entered the courier station, and the officials sent by the Ministry of Rites were very busy. Naturally, no one noticed where Fan Xian had gone. Outside the courier station, there were 2 carriages with no one alighted. One was the carriage of the eldest princess. Everyone knew that Her Highness was grieving, and naturally did not dare to disturb her. As for the officials of Northern Qi, in the other carriage was the handsome demon outside, and they paid even less attention to him. Only the Tiger Guards and Overwatch Council officials that Fan Xian had specifically left behind guarded the 2 carriages vigilantly. A small corner of the curtain of the second carriage was lifted, and an incomparably pale and cold hand beckoned. The Overwatch Council official next to the carriage immediately walked over. He leaned against the corner of the curtain and asked in a low voice, "Sir Yen, what are your orders?" Through the corner of the curtain, Yen Bingyun's handsome but exceptionally cold face appeared. "Where did you go, sir?" he asked quietly. In the diplomatic mission, there was only one person whom he could call Sir, Fan Xian. The Overwatch Council official looked at him and said in a low voice, "I do not know." Yen Bingyun frowned, as if there was something he could not say. After hesitating for a while, he finally said quietly, "Along the way, has there been a woman who likes to wear light blue clothes following the carriages? She likes to ride a big red horse." The Overwatch Council official shook his head. Yen Bingyun's face showed no expression. He put down the curtain and confirmed that Lady Shern had not risked coming to see him. His mood relaxed a little, but for some reason after relaxing he felt a little gloomy. Outside the sorghum field was a lonely pavilion. Next to the pavilion was an old road that had been abandoned for many years. A carriage was parked on the road and 2 girls stood inside. A gust of wind blew past, rustling the sorghum field. Fan Xian walked out and slowly walked into the pavilion. His eyes were gentle as he looked at the incomparably plump girl. He said quietly, "Who would have thought that after entering Shangjing, the only time we could really talk would be when we were about to leave?" Si Lily bowed slightly to him. Her voice trembled slightly. "Greetings, sir." Fan Xian did not continue speaking. He only glanced at Haiteng, who was standing to the side. Haiteng smiled and put her hands in her pockets. The tip of her foot touched the cracked ground beneath the pavilion, and she floated away, leaving the pavilion to the strange couple. As soon as Haiteng left the pavilion, the gentleness on Fan Xian's face disappeared without a trace. He looked at Si Lily seriously. "After entering the palace, you must be careful. The Empress Dowager is not a simple character. It will not be easy to hide from her." Si Lily looked at him, and a trace of tenderness gradually appeared in her eyes. She said softly, "You just want me to be careful. Nothing else?" Fan Xian smiled, but did not go forward to hug her frail shoulders. "Since you insist on staying in Northern Qi, why do you want to soften my heart now? Do you women find it fun to provoke us filthy things?" Si Lily smiled lightly. She did not look as weak as she had in front of Haiteng. "Isn't that the case, sir? Although I insist on staying in Northern Qi, you spoke first. Are you afraid that I will ask you to take me back to the capital?" A trace of ridicule flashed in Fan Xian's eyes. "Perhaps you will one day become the mistress of the Northern Qi harem. Why bother hanging around with people like me?" Si Lily also laughed. "To have a place to stay in the palace is good enough. How could I dare hope for more?" Fan Xian shook his head and suddenly said, "Lily, you are different from other women in the world." Si Lily made an "oh" sound and then responded calmly, Perhaps it is because I have traveled the world since I was young, and have been to many places. Compared to those women who stay in their houses all day embroider and compose poems, I am a bit more presumptuous. Fan Xian was silent. He knew that what she said made sense. In today's world, ordinary women could only sit at home. Few had the experience Sea Lily had, and the freedom Haitang had. He turned his head to look in the direction Haitang had disappeared. In a serious tone, he said, I believe in your ability, but I must warn you not to underestimate those who seem old and muddle-headed. The atmosphere in the pavilion seemed to freeze. After a long time, Sea Lily bowed deeply and lowered her head. A few strands of her fine black hair danced in the wind. In a soft voice she said, Perhaps you don't believe me, but Lily really likes to talk with you, just like in the carriage when we came here. Fan Xian looked at her. He didn't know how much of what she said was true, and how much was false. Sea Lily smiled. Her beautiful face looked incomparably charming. Sir, I am very grateful that you cured me of the poison on the way. What you said is true. I am not Chun Pingping, Fan Xian said. I believe that even if there is a conflict of interest, it can be resolved in a more gentle way. And I do not wish for the Emperor of Northern Qi to be poisoned because of you. Of course, now it seems that Chun Pingping's plan had no hope of success from the beginning. Sea Lily's cheeks reddened. She knew that the man who was closest to her had already guessed something. Fan Xian continued in a quiet voice. You will live in the palace from now on. Your status will rise. No matter how powerful the Overwatch Council is, they will not be able to control you. So whether or not the agreement between us will be effective depends on us. Sea Lily said seriously, Sir, please do not worry. Fan Xian looked at the beautiful girl's brow, and suddenly felt a little absent-minded. After a while, he said, Wait for news in the north. Be careful. I believe it won't be long before someone helps you avenge your family. Sea Lily suddenly raised her head and looked at Fan Xian in disbelief. Fan Xian ignored the surprise in her eyes. He took a piece of paper from his sleeve and gave it to her. Contact me through this person. After you memorize it, destroy it. Fan Xian suddenly smiled. I can allow you to abandon the agreement between us, but I will not accept you betraying me. This contact is a one-way street. Even if you sell him to Northern Qi, he will not be of any use, so it is best that you do not take risk. Seeing the young man's strange sweet smile, Sea Lily's heart trembled. She didn't know why she was afraid, but she quickly nodded. Also if... Fan Xian was silent for a while, then suddenly said, If there comes a day when you do not want to stay in the Northern Qi Palace, let me know. I will take care of it. Thank you, sir. Sea Lily weakly bowed her head in thanks. Her thanks finally revealed a glimmer of sincerity and reluctance. She knew that after this thanks, she would have to leave. With a slightly sad expression, she said, After this farewell, I do not know when we will meet again. Every time I think about it, I cannot help but feel my heart break. After saying this, Sea Lily resolutely turned and left the pavilion, leaving behind Fan Xian, who was frowning deeply, still thinking about the meaning hidden in the words, heartbreak. Watching the carriage gradually leave along the abandoned ancient road, Fan Xian's face showed no expression, but he sighed in the depths of his heart. He then punched a pillar of the pavilion with a bang. The pavilion had been in disrepair for a long time, and was already tottering on the verge of collapse. Now that Fan Xian had punched it, it creaked. A figure floated down from the pavilion. Who else could it be but Haitang? Haitang gently landed next to Fan Xian and smiled bitterly. Duo did not overhear anything. If you had, Fan Xian said, I would have become mute. Haitang smiled. Master Fan, you are about to leave Northern Qi. I do not know when we will meet again. Fan Xian thought of his sister back home in the capital and couldn't help but sigh. I do not think it will be long. Where did your illustrious teacher go? He suddenly changed the subject. I came to Northern Qi, but I did not pay a visit to this great grandmaster. It is truly a pity. Haiteng thought for a moment and decided not to hide this matter. She quietly said, 3 days before the Southern Dynasty's diplomatic mission entered the capital, teacher received a piece of wood and left Shangjing. No one knows where he went, including the Empress Dowager and me. In these days in Shangjing, you helped me hide many things. Fan Xian looked at the lonely tree at the end of the ancient road. I truly must thank you for that. So, regarding the matter of goods heading north, I am currently discussing it with Chang Ningho and Xinzhong. If that emperor of yours needs to borrow money from me, he must get rid of Xinzhong. That man looks ordinary, but he is actually a very powerful person. Haiteng was silent for a moment, then said, "This is a secret between the two of us." Fan Xian looked at her incomparably bright eyes and said, word by word, "In this world, other than my brother-in-law, I have rarely seen a pure fool. How many people do you think the secret between us can be hidden from? Duo, on this trip to Northern Qi, you have helped me a great deal, both openly and secretly. Don't think that senior brother of yours did not notice." Haiteng frowned. "What are you trying to say?" Fan Xian smiled. "What I want to say is, since you and the Emperor are preparing to escape from the shadow of the Empress Dowager, then you cannot just count on the struggles of the court, and you cannot count on an outsider like me to provide you with funds. After all, Northern Qi is a great power. If you want to completely control it, it will take years." Haiteng smiled. "I think Master Fan might have misunderstood something." "Oh." Fan Xian smiled. "What are you worried about?" Haiteng seemed to be talking about a different topic. "I am a good student who respects his teacher." Fan Xian suddenly said, "Zhuang Mohan is dead." Zhuang Mohan had students all over the world and was revered by all. Aside from the incident last year, there was nothing to nitpick about his moral writings. Even Haiteng greatly respected this old man, but she had been waiting for the diplomatic mission in the suburbs of the capital, so she did not know of his passing. Now that she heard the news, her face revealed a trace of shock and sorrow, and she did not know what to say. For a moment, there was a sense of desolation in the pavilion. After a long time, it was Fan Xian who broke the silence. "Shaoan is dead. Zhuang Mohan is dead. All the great figures of the past will gradually grow old and die. Even if you are a good student who respects his teacher, I think you should be prepared for that day." Haiteng stared into his eyes. "Master, you seem to be hinting at something." Fan Xian smiled. "I can understand the strong desire of a young man to be the master of his own house." Haiteng smiled, slightly dispelling the sadness she felt after hearing of Master Zhuang's death. "Why is it that when so many heavy things come out of your mouth, they seem so much lighter? Why is it that when so many dark things come out of your mouth, they immediately become incomparably bright? Because the dark night gave us black eyes, and I want to use them to find the light." Haiteng tilted her head slightly. "I remember you saying that you want to use it, to roll your eyes at the world." "The world," Fan Xian said, "this world is theirs, and it is also ours. But in the end, it is ours." The thick clouds in the sky floated over, completely covering the sun. But the sun was too strong. Even so, it could not hide the bright red light that seeped through the edges of the clouds. It was as if a fairy had used her skillful hands to embroider a golden border. A gust of wind blew over from the plains, passing through the ancient path on the ground and the pavilion. Fan Xian looked at Haiteng. Duo, thank you for your help these past few days." Haiteng finally took her hands out of the large pockets of her coarse clothes. Somewhat unnaturally, she curtsied like an ordinary girl. "Master Fan is too polite." Below the pavilion, Fan Xian stepped forward and pulled her into his arms for a hug. For some reason, even with Haiteng's extremely high level of cultivation, she was unable to avoid his hug. Letting go immediately, he revealed a sincere smile. To tell you the truth, if you and I could really become friends, I think it would be a very good thing. Haitang gently tidied up the black hair at the corner of her forehead. Her ordinary face did not show the slightest bit of embarrassment or unease because of the extremely intimate hug. Smiling, she said, "Likewise." Haitang stood under the dilapidated pavilion, beside the ancient path, watching Fan Xian's figure disappear into the distance. She could not help but tilt her head slightly, thinking back to her days in Shangjing. A trace of a smile rose to the corners of her lips. She thought to herself that this young master of the southern court was indeed an extremely interesting person, with extremely keen eyes. Presumably, when he returned to the kingdom of Qing, there would be some very subtle changes in the south. She sighed, dispelling the grief that had arisen from Zhuang Mohan's passing. Only then did she remember that she had ultimately forgotten one thing. Did the Haitang Poetry Society and Story of the Stone have anything to do with her? She unconsciously reached out to tighten the floral scarf on her head, but found that she touched nothing but air. She immediately reacted, and could not help but feel a slight heat on her face. Only now did she realize that no matter how well she had hidden it, she had still been a little nervous during the hug. She had not even noticed that the little thief had stolen her floral scarf. Fan Xian was currently walking through the tall sorghum. Occasionally, branches would hit his face and shatter, but there was a trace of a happy and pure smile on his face. His trip to northern Qi had finally come to a relatively satisfactory conclusion, and after his rebirth, he had met some interesting people, such as Yen Bingyun, that block of ice, and Haitang, that seemingly tacky but actually delicate flower. Aside from some conflicts of interest and differences in philosophy, he very much enjoyed talking to Haitang. The emperor also wanted to have a son, Ku he also wanted to eat meat, Cripple Chun also wanted to go to the latrine, and Fan Xian also wanted to have friends. He tucked the floral scarf in his hand into his clothes and pushed aside the plants in front of him. Looking at the faint green smoke rising from the relay station in the distance, he lightly hummed, "Throw, throw, throw the handkerchief." Chapter 254. The Fog of the North Sea chapter ended. I was actually a little nervous when I wrote it because it was a new situation, new characters, past stories, and current thoughts. The overall quality was passable. One of the most important topics in this chapter was metabolism. Northern Qi was the successor of Northern Wei, the center of the old era. Most of the outstanding characters of that time were in this country, and these people gradually grew old and died in these 99 chapters. Characters like the Emperor and Haitang, although still young, would eventually stand on the stage. I almost forgot to say that for me, the thing I was most proud of about this chapter was that it happened to end at the end of the 99 chapters, exactly as planned. And for Fan Xian, he not only had to follow in the footsteps of his predecessors, he had to follow in the footsteps of his predecessors, he had to follow in the footsteps of Zhuang Mohan, and stand in the footsteps of Shaoan. More importantly, after entering the cave, he had a clearer understanding of his predecessors, and that predecessor's affairs, and he had to gradually break away from that omnipresent feeling of encirclement. Fan Xian could only be the Fan Xian who was disgusted. Of course, the so-called self-mastery did not mean that he would not inherit. He had to do something himself, to surpass something. That was too tiring, and I would not write it like that. Aside from the core ideology of the year of Qinyu, the main objective was to make Fan Xian the most handsome second generation in all of the novels. One of my life fantasies was to suddenly inherit a distant relative's fortune, which was worth tens of billions of dollars. Did anyone not want that? Sigh, that could only mean that I was indeed very vulgar. As for what the core ideology was, I had originally planned to write the third book before concluding it, but I'll say it now. I planned to write 3 novels, and the first one was already finished. The Vermilion Bird Chronicles was about, a bad life is better than a good death. The second book of the Year of Qing Yu was about, living is a very rare thing, so one should live happily. The third book was about, how to live, a story about seeking life in the midst of death. It was a very nonsensical 3 principles, but sometimes nonsense was actually very reasonable. The Year of Qing Yu was a popular book, and there was no profound meaning to it. The key was to tell the story. I would not purposely use words because words were not concise. If I did, it would be like an embroidered toilet seat. I also would not purposely ask for meaning, because Fan Xian was not Su San Duo. He was a person with a very clear goal. The 3 representatives of the first volume had already been very clear. However, there would always be some sour and sweet emotions in the word. That could not be helped. Humans are emotional creatures, and it was inevitable that I would be biased towards certain characters and have some feelings for them. What I had was a passionate heart, and the sincerity of telling a story. I had to make sure to update every day, so I didn't have time to take a nap in between. There would always be various things around me, especially after I reached the threshold of 30. I suddenly realized that there were many things in life that I had to take care of. I was originally a person with a lot of time, but now I inevitably felt that I didn't have enough time. However, these were all private matters, so I didn't intend to talk about them here and affect everyone's reading. Too unreasonable, too unreasonable. I cupped my hands and walked off the stage. Write one last sentence. Transmigrating was a very cool thing. I decided that, if I had the chance in the future, I would transmigrate again. That time, I would transmigrate to a real dynasty. At worst, I would be the first to discover tobacco, chili, and white wine. As long as I had these 3 things in my life, what could I not bear? Chapter 255. It was early autumn, and above the plains to the north of the capital of the Kingdom of Qing, a patch of clouds appeared and disappeared. The people working in the fields did not raise their heads. They had no interest in watching the beautiful tricks the heavens played with the shape of the clouds and the refraction of the sun. They just wanted to harvest the golden crops before the rain cloud floated over. There had been a lot of rain this year. It was said that the river in the south had swollen violently. But for the people living in the north, the safety of the river banks had nothing to do with them. They were more worried about whether or not this damned rain would delay the harvest of the year. Occasionally, a few fat field mice would fearlessly pass under the feet of the farmers, snatching the scattered grains in the fields. The scythes in the farmers' hands were too lazy to deal with these scourges. They focused on harvesting the grains. In the endless rice fields on both sides of the official road, the sounds of harvesting gradually merged into one, forming a neat and beautiful sound that could make anyone who heard it feel a certain sense of satisfaction. The farmers, who were bare-chested, were facing the yellow soil with their backs to the sky, showing the small cuts made by the leaves on their bodies to the cold sky. However, they did not notice that there was a long line of carriages on the official road that seemed to have no end in sight moving slowly toward them. The Kingdom of Qing's diplomatic mission to northern Qi had finally fulfilled its promise of leaving in spring and returning in autumn. They had hurried back to their homeland in the middle of September, but the returning carriages were even larger than the ones that had left. Other than the gifts that northern Qi had given in return to show their sincerity, there were also many officials and ceremonial guards. It was enough to show the importance that the northern Qi court placed on the princess's marriage. After all, this was the first marriage between the 2 countries. No one knew what kind of change this kind of diplomatic relationship would bring to the continent, which had just experienced 20 years of peace. Other than the magnificent carriage that the great princess of northern Qi was in, there was another carriage in the long line of carriages that was more eye-catching. Regardless of whether it was compared to the colorful carriages of northern Qi or the black carriages of the Qin court, this carriage appeared much more wretched. Although the horses pulling the carriage were also fine horses, even the horses' heads swayed weakly. The members of the diplomatic mission knew that it was because the carriage was too heavy. On top of it were the books that Zhuang Mohan of Northern Qi had given to the head envoy, Fan Xian, before he died. The books looked unremarkable, but they were much heavier than the eldest princess dowry. Every time they saw the carriage, many of the members of the diplomatic mission could not help but feel a sense of respect. It was not only because of Sir Fan's radiant face, but also because of his scholarly style. Everyone knew that ever since they had passed through several small countries in the north and entered the border of Tsangzhou, Sir Fan had locked himself in the carriage, reading day and night. He was not even willing to come down to eat or rest. "I can't live like this anymore." Fan Xian sighed and put the book of poems from the previous dynasty back into the box behind him. The curtain of the carriage was blown shut by the wind, plunging the carriage into darkness. It was impossible to see the expression on his face, but from the sound of his voice, it was clear that Master Fan was not very willing to stay in the carriage and pretend to be a diligent literary master of the present age. The journey south had been smooth and peaceful. After the eldest princess of Northern Qi had shaken off the grief of Zhuang Mohan's death, she had regained the modesty and self-respect that a noble should have. She did not cause him any trouble. On the contrary, in the courier station, in the city guard's manor, Fan Xian was able to speak with the beautiful eldest princess occasionally. They chatted about more mundane matters, and it was to relieve the loneliness of the journey. Although he did not dare to be overly courteous as an official, talking to a girl was much better than talking to Gao and the other cold-faced swordsman, or Yan Bingyun, that block of ice. But this situation finally ended after they passed Tsangzhou. It was not that Fan Xian did not dare speak to the eldest prince's future daughter-in-law upon returning to the kingdom of Qing. It was because there was suddenly one more person in the diplomatic mission, and that person's identity was a little special. Her background was a little strange, and she had an unclear relationship with one of the members of the diplomatic mission. That person had been staying in the eldest princess carriage, and Fan Xian did not want to see her crying every day. So he hid himself in the carriage, leaving the difficult problem to Yan Bingyun, Master Yan Jr. Along the way, there were reports from the Overwatch Council. Other than the few strange murder cases in the south that still had no clues, there was nothing special. No one thought that the most shocking news would come from the north. Xinzhong had died. On a rainy night, under the protection of 13 brocade guards, he had been killed by Shang Shanhu, a spear-wielding general of the military, in the middle of the street. The provost of the brocade guard, the head of Northern Qi's secret service after Shaoen, had died in such a cowardly manner. This seemingly absurd news had already been proven to be the truth. Fan Xian rubbed his temples and laughed bitterly. Thinking of Wang Qinyan's description in the report, he could not help but feel a little shocked. According to the intelligence report, on that rainy night, Shang Shanhu was clad in black armor from head to toe. He held a long spear in his hand as he galloped down the long street. With one strike of his spear, he beheaded Xinzhong, who was in the palanquin. With another sweep of his spear, he tore apart the bodies of the bodyguards around Xinzhong. It was only when he retracted his spear and galloped back to his residence that the rain on the long street seemed to dare to fall. Such a display of power was truly frightening. A peerless expert of the 9th level had used such a valiant method to directly tear apart all the conspiracies and schemes. He had used pure force to challenge the authority of the entire imperial court. Fan Xian had not expected Shang Shanhu to be such a tyrannical figure. He knew that he had still underestimated the iron-blooded nature of the military trained on the battlefield. He could not help but feel his head ache even more. No matter how much he rubbed it, he could not alleviate it. After all, many people knew that he had played a disgraceful role in Shaoen's escape. Even if Tan Wu had not shouted, "Kill me, Fan Xian," before he killed himself, Shang Shanhu would still have blamed Shaoen's death and the betrayal of the people of the south on Fan Xian's head. Fan Xian could only hope that Qing and Northern Qi would remain friends for generations, never to fight again, never to give Shang Shanhu a chance to face him on the battlefield. Of course, there were still many suspicious points about Shen Zhong's death. After all, he was the head of the Brocade Guard. No matter how ruthless Shang Shanhu was, or how angry the military was, to kill him in the middle of the street was not an easy task. Furthermore, the reaction of the Northern Qi court seemed to confirm this point. After a night of silence in the palace, Shang Shanhu was placed under house arrest in the manor and his title of nobility was taken away. Another edict shockingly pointed out the many crimes Shen Zhong had committed over the years. Each stroke of the imperial edict threw the recently deceased Shen Zhong into a vat of dirty water, making it impossible for him to rise again for the rest of his life. The Shen mansion was subsequently raided, and the Brocade Guard was purged. The military was proud and elated. Although the young emperor maintained his silence, it could be assumed that he was happy in his heart. This was because, through this incident, Shang Shanhu's resentment towards the royal family would lessen. However, a fierce tiger like Shang Shanhu was not an easy character to control. Just by looking at the fact that the palace still had Shang Shanhu imprisoned in the capital, one could tell that they were still having a headache over how to deal with him. Naturally, they could not kill him. No one wanted to bear the repercussions of the military. They could not let him go either. Who knew what would happen to him when he returned to the mountains? Fan Xian shook his head. He had not thought that after hearing his words, Haidang would act so quickly and so fiercely against Shen Zhong. But after constructing the scene of Shang Shanhu killing Shen Zhong in the rainy night in his mind, Fan Xian, who should have been worried about his own safety, felt an inexplicable sense of pleasure and admiration. Ruthless and decisive, quick to repay kindness and enmity. When Shang Shanhu slowly raised his black spear on the horse, ready to reap Shen Zhong's life, there was no longer a trace of reverence in his eyes. That night rain on the long street, how arrogant was it! He lifted the curtain of the carriage and jumped out without calling for the driver to stop. Standing on the official road, he waved his hand to disperse the oncoming yellow wind. Looking at the farmers laboring on both sides of the road, his heart stirred. He threw all the matters of the north to the back of his mind. Those matters could no longer affect him, and he could not affect them for the time being, so he could only throw them aside. Raising his head to look at the sky, which alternated between light and darkness, he narrowed his eyes. He knew that he should be able to reach Longquan Inn by the end of the day, and he relaxed a little. The princess had married far away, so the journey should be much slower than it was now. But Fan Xian had a hidden concern, so he took advantage of the fact that no one in the diplomatic mission dared to say anything, and sped up the journey. Seeing that they were about to enter the capital, he finally stopped thinking about his family. Tomorrow, he should be able to see Wan. He wondered if her health had improved. As for his sister, if Uncle Wu Zhu was in the capital, she should be fine for the time being. Getting into the carriage behind them, he looked at Yan Bingyun, who was pretending to be asleep. He frowned and reprimanded him. "You caused this mess, and you will have to deal with it. We are about to enter the capital. Are you going to let her follow Her Highness? If Northern Qi finds out that we are sheltering their felon, how will the court explain it?" Yan Bingyun opened his eyes, but turned his head away from looking at his superior. He looked at the golden paddy fields outside the carriage window, and a trace of struggle flashed through his eyes. In the end, he only said lightly, "Shen Zhong's death was only one step in the Northern Qi Emperor's plan to seize power. As for her life or death, I believe Northern Qi will not care." Fan Xian looked at him, and his tone suddenly softened. "If you don't care about her life or death, then leave it to me." Yan Bingyun slowly turned his head, and a fierce look appeared in his eyes. Killing her will do us no good. If I don't want to, I don't want to. Fan Xian shook his head. I thought you were no ordinary person. I didn't expect you to be so self-deceiving. Yan Bingyun did not reply. He silently turned his head away, watching the farmers reap the heavy harvest outside the window. In the luxurious carriage at the front of the group, the great princess of northern Qi sighed. She looked at her sister, who had been very close since childhood, and said nothing. Miss Shen, who had luckily escaped from Shangjing, was currently lying on the window frame in a daze. She looked at the same scenery as Yan Bingyun, but it was unknown whether she was thinking about her lover's heartlessness, the tragedy of her family being ruined, or the sorrow of leaving the country. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.